It was raining heavily on the land where Grand Duke Nocturne was staying as he poured down on the beautiful two-story building, where you could clearly hear the raindrops as they poured down on the rooftop. The lady in a white dress and black shoes that had a shining ribbon on them walked through the rain, as she didn't have much of a choice since she needed to avail herself immediately, and the rain was not stopping at any time. The butler in a black suit held an umbrella as he stood next to the lady who was also in the rain. She held a wild umbrella with black luggage in her hand, so the butler immediately directed her to where she was supposed to go and told her that she could leave her luggage with the maids in the castle. So in no time, they had already reached the door of the castle, and the butler went straight to open the door for the lady in white dress. It was a very magnificent building that had a lot of pillars in it, so he stood by her and ushered her in as he welcomed her into the Blackwell Grand Duchy at the same time. The lady that was ushered into the palace was none other than Lady Laria Sherwood. She was a pretty damsel that had big blue eyes, and she had very long blonde hair that passed down to her shoulder level. So she dressed in her white royal attire with a diamond ribbon placed around her neck that glittered. So the butler walked in front of Lady Laria in the main hall of the Grand Ducal estate, where nothing could be heard other than the pattering of the rain. So he led her as she walked behind him to show her around the palace, as she was new there and didn't know her way around. As Lady Maria was still standing behind the butler, a thought suddenly flashed through her mind, and she remembered that the reality she was currently in was actually a novel. So she stopped, and she stared around. A man dressed in a royal robe held his sword in one hand, and his other hand was held by a lady who was crying as she clung to him tightly. So as they continued running inside the palace, she was left with no option but to question him as to where they were actually going. But the man seemed as if he didn't even hear what the lady said to him, so he ignored her completely and continued walking. But all of a sudden he finally turned around and halted. So as they both stopped, he quickly took his hand off of her grip and beckoned her to let go of his hand. The moment she let go of his hand, blood immediately spilled out and he held his fist in the air. The lady in a white dress leaned on the chest of the man, who wore purple princely attire. They both stood and faced each other with bloodstains still in her hands. She held him by the chest as she looked straight into his eyes and asked him if he was really planning on killing Heinrich. Within a short period of time, he dropped off his blood-stained sword, stepped closely towards the lady in a white dress, and moved as if he were actually going to hurt her. He then told her that he was actually going to kill Heinrich, as he had asked earlier, because he couldn't stand the fact that Heinrich was actually her close friend and it drives him insane. As he couldn't take it any longer, he stood as the lightning struck behind him. With tears running down his cheek, he was filled with a lot of pain and rage in his eyes. So he said to her that instead of him losing her to that bastard called Heinrich, he would prefer if everyone died by the hand of his sword. Lady Laria was actually so lost in her thoughts and imagined all this in her that she didn't realize the moment they had reached the door of the room the butler took her to. So she stood and smiled with her big blue eyes the moment she heard her name being called. So she laughed and stared at him as if she were actually paying attention to what he was actually showing her. But since the butler didn't quite know what was happening with her, he pointed out his hand to the door and told her that this was actually the reception room where the Grand Duke was lodged. With no waste of time, the butler, who had a mustache that almost covered his nose, stood and turned to Lady Laria as they were both still at the door. He asked if she was ready to go see the Duke, but Lady Laria wasn't quite sure if she was ready or not, so she stood facing him and didn't say anything. But as Lady Laria Sherwood stood there with her big blue eyes and long blonde hair that had a flower ribbon tied behind it, she still wasn't sure if she was actually ready to go see the Duke, so the butler tried all he could by encouraging her, and he told her she could do it. It wasn't something difficult to do at all. The butler wasn't ready for the lady's so-called laxity, so he went ahead to open the Duke's door and went straight to where he was. The Duke was actually standing by the window with his head facing towards the palace garden. So as he stood behind the Duke, the butler said to the Duke that Lady Laria Sherwood had arrived to see him. So the Duke, who also had a diamond pendant placed on his neck with his purple fierce eyes, turned to the butler and told him that there was actually a man he was supposed to have a meeting with, and in order not to waste much time, let the interview begin immediately. The Duke, who looked and dressed so innocent in his royal attire from first glance, wasn't actually the kind person one would have thought he was. He was a cold-blooded and merciless duke who didn't regard anyone other than himself, to the point that he actually took the life of his own father, and a special name was given to him, Nocturne Blackwell, because of his cruel ways. But it was actually funny to think that the Almighty Duke was actually the male lead character of the novel that Lady Laria wrote. So he stood there in his black and red royal attire. He lifted up one of his hands and stared at it. And in this particular novel, it was written that the Duke was destined to have a fated encounter with the Saintess of the Holy Land, which was actually Lady Laria. But she was just a character, the lady who wore a white dress that covered her face, but she was reincarnated as Lady Laria. But in this particular crooked tale of a love story written in the novel, she actually became the villainous character who was fated to get in between the love life of the Duke Nocturne. As the Nocturne sat on the throne with both of his hands placed on either side with his legs crossed, Lady Laria stood there before him and knelt down and begged for his love as she lifted up her hand and placed it under his chin. The Duke was not buying any of those because he was quite in love with somebody else. Lady Laria stood there on her knees. Her heart was really shattered because she actually loved Nocturne, but all her advances didn't seem to pay out, so she began to shed tears with pain in her eyes as she stared directly at the Duke. But she was rather blinded by jealousy in her heart, which took the best part of her when she took a sword that was placed at her back, which she intended to kill the two couples. Nocturne and his bride stood in shock and couldn't believe that Laria would actually try to do something of that nature, so Nocturne held his bride in a white dress closely to himself with a lot of rage in his eyes. Obviously, Nocturne wasn't left with a bit of a choice but to protect the lives of his bride and his own, and by doing so, he had to take the life of Laria in his fierce anger, so he took his mighty sword and slew her. Lady Laria was brought to her sudden end as she lay down in her pool of blood, but as she looked into the mirror by the wall, she rather saw a different person than herself, so he held her hand on her cheek and placed the other on the mirror. She was so horrified because she was actually the character Laria, and since according to what was written in the novel, her fate was actually paced at her dying in the end, that traumatized her even more. She couldn't believe what was happening the very moment she opened her eyes and woke up in a rather strange world. So she sat on the bed in the room and covered herself with a white blanket as she bottled up all the grief in her heart because of her preordained poor future. Even the maids in the castle couldn't believe what they saw. They always knew Lady Laria to be a cruel mistress and never thought she could ever be in a rather sober state. So they both watched her as she sat on the bed, all tied up with her blanket, and she was grieving. But since they didn't want to cause any trouble, they decided not to intervene in anything and let their mistress be because they didn't want to be the ones that would end up adding to her problems. So they left her as she was still lying down on the bed in her room and hoped that she would later decide to come out on her own. As she was still covered with the blanket on the bed, she bowed down her head as she suddenly reasoned within herself that all that had befell her might be actually a punishment for her failing to finish writing her tragedy novel. But it occurred to her that it wasn't actually a tangible reason to treat the author of a story just because she didn't complete the novel. It just didn't add up. Since she's been sitting on the bed for a long period of time, she was a bit fed up, and she decided she would take a leap of faith. She stood immediately from the bed and put her shoes on her feet. She said to herself that since he was fated to be doomed, it was the result of her meeting with Nocturne as written in the novel, and since they haven't met yet, she decided to totally ignore him and steer clear of him at all times, since she had a clear knowledge of where he might possibly be, and with that, she might have a great chance of survival. Worrying forever won't bring any solution at all, and actually giving it a try was worth it after all. So she stood up from the bed, took the feather, dipped it inside the ink, and decided that she would use the advantage she had as the original author to guarantee that Laria Sherwood was entitled to new plans for her life. So as she finally decided to come out of her shell and step out to accept her fate, what she thought seemed like a bright future ahead of her turned out to be something completely different. It all happened the moment one morning she proceeded to the door and held the handle to go out that she realized there was a small crack in her plan. The lady walked straight into the dining room in the palace and pushed the door wide open as she stood by the door with her long blonde hair that was tied with a pink ribbon. So she stared at the rest of the people that were already seated in the various seats as they were eating their meal on the table. Her mother was also a very beautiful woman who actually had the same big blue eyes and blonde hair, Lady Laria was actually a carbon copy of her mother, but her mother wasn't really annoyed at her for coming late to the table. She only smiled and asked Laria why she came late. The other two boys seated in the dining room were still engrossed in their meal as Laria walked in. So one of them actually looked up and smiled because he wasn't surprised Laria would actually come late. He knew her character after all, but the other gentleman stood there on his seat and continued with his meal as he bowed his head down. But Lady Laria looked rather surprised and shocked at the same time and didn't actually know the tangible reason to give her mother for coming late. So she stood there with her mouth open, and she pondered within herself whether she could actually come up with something reasonable to give as an excuse. Without wasting time, Laria prostrated to greet her mother by holding her pink dress, bowed a little, and said to her mother that she was sorry for coming late. But her mother wasn't buying at all, so she turned her face away from Laria. She rather thought it was shameless of her to greet her good morning so casually prior to the fact that she was late, and made them wait for her before taking their breakfast. But Laria felt a bit ashamed as she heard all that her mother said to her, so she bowed down her head with her blonde hair, and a little tear came down from her eyes, because she actually did anything wrong that was worth that level of ridicule. So she stood there, and she was not happy at all. Her mother didn't care at all. All she wanted to do was dash out what she had in mind for Laria. So she added by saying that her father worked so hard to the point that he had to stay far away from home, far from the empire, and also far away from his own family just to put food on their table. And his one and only daughter is staying in her room all day without doing anything at all, and she still showed up late for even their breakfast. So she smiled and said to Laria, "Didn't she find all she did rather embarrassing?" Laria still stood there as she heard all that her mother had said to her, but she didn't move at all. She stood where she was across the long dining table that had several dishes placed on it. Her mother then ordered her to stop all the dallying. She should hurry up and get seated. But Laria wasn't surprised that all that happened that way, even the nagging by her mother when she came to take her breakfast, because she clearly knew it was going to happen as written in the novel. So she quietly walked towards the designated seat where her plate of food awaited her. It seemed a bit odd that her so-called siblings that sat at the dining table didn't even try to side her at all when she was being scolded by her mother. They rather stood there as if nothing was actually happening. One of them was busying himself with his food, while the other one was actually at her. But she didn't let any of those weigh her down. She was determined to eat her breakfast in peace. So Laria went ahead to sit down and immediately took her first bite with her fork from the food that was kept for her on the table. As they were all seated on the table and Laria went ahead to start eating her meal, the taste of her first bite wasn't quite as she expected it to be, so she had to spit it out on a piece of cloth that was placed in her mouth. But what she didn't really understand was how the rest of her family were actually enjoying their meal, and hers didn't taste. She immediately suspected her younger brother of having put salt in her food, as he was laughing hard the moment he saw her spitting out the food. So she held the piece of cloth in her hand and placed it on her mouth so that she could wipe away the irritating taste of the food. But Laria wasn't really surprised after all, because it was just like other usual occurrences that happened to her day in and day out. Some were the crude teasing and jokes her young brother frequently does to her. As she couldn't take it anymore, she had to call the attention of one of the maids in the castle. While one of her siblings still stood there with two cutlery in his hands and his head facing the table, he continued with his own meal. So Laria turned to the maid that stood by her side and asked her if she could have the same dish that her family members were eating. But the maid was a little bit thrilled as to how Lady Laria would ask her such a question. The maid immediately wanted to point out to Lady Laria that the meal she had tasted was the same meal that her family members were eating, but Lady Laria wasn't ready to hear that. So the maid hurriedly went and brought her a different meal, galette, and placed it in front of her on the table. Lady Laria, with her big blue eyes and long blonde hair, turned to the maid to thank her for actually saving her from starving that early morning. But it all seemed as if the maid still had something in mind that she wanted to tell, as she was still standing next to her. Immediately the maid saw that Lady Laria was about to get on and start eating her meal. She was looking a bit nervous because of what she was indeed telling her. So she stared at her with brown eyes widely open and went ahead to tell her that she must only eat a small portion of the food because she was scared Her Majesty would complain again about the food. But Lady Laria smiled as she placed one of her cutlery pieces on the plate of food that was before her. So she asked her if the reason she was worried was because she saw her sneezing earlier on after she tasted the food brought to her before this one. And so she said to the maid that she really appreciated her concerns, but shouldn't worry. Nothing bad will happen this time around. The lady with long blonde hair stood and began to think about what the maid was actually trying to point out, which was actually kind of true. So she placed the fork in her mouth and pondered how it had been a while since she had had galette. But it was actually a dish she enjoyed in her previous life, although it wasn't quite easy to prepare since you would have to clean up after cooking because of the hassle that was littered on the floor that came from the buckwheat flour. Laria's younger brother was still laughing at her as he sat close to his mother because of the incident that happened earlier on, and so did her mother, but she only smiled and stared at her, hoping all was well. But Laria's mother looked a bit worried since the look on Laria was a bit serious all of a sudden, and so her mother noticed immediately, so she quickly asked her if she was actually all right or if something was bothering her. It all seemed a bit strange to Laria that her mother would ask her such a question, since it was clearly obvious that the platter of food served to her didn't taste great, and they could all clearly see that she didn't like it. So she placed her hand on her cheek and wondered why her mother would be asking her if something happened to her face. It didn't add up at all, but it was rather weird that Laria left out the part where, in the novel, she wrote that the character, Laria, actually had an allergic reaction to buckwheat. She totally didn't write anything about Laria having any allergic reaction. It wasn't her fault that she went ahead to eat the meal because she didn't know of its repercussions and that she wasn't reading a novel. She was actually living a life in it, so she opened her mouth in shock when she came to the realization of the sudden state of Laria. Her mother didn't waste time going to the doctor because she was so concerned about the health of her daughter. So the doctor went ahead to administer the treatment to Laria and said to her mother that they were actually lucky that they alerted him in time as the symptoms of the rash appeared and he was able to treat it quickly. He also added by recommending to her that she would need to rest well for a while. But her mother folded her two hands and was quite furious as to why Laria did what she did, because she clearly knew she had an allergic reaction to buckwheat, but she still went ahead to eat it. As they were still in the Laria room, her younger brother, who walked beside her bed and had been laughing at her all this while, pointed out to everyone that she must have tried to prove herself after all the teasing he did to her. So as the doctor was about to leave, he urged Laria to take good care of herself and be mindful of what she ate since she had an allergic reaction. Laria stood on her bed in her room, and she was a bit puzzled by what was actually going on. So she held her cheek with her hand and began to reason about how the character had an allergic reaction to buckwheat because she never wrote that in her story. So her maid stood by her as she was still seated on the bed and told her that it was actually the main reason why she didn't serve her any galette at first, because it contained a huge amount of buckwheat in it. And she was really concerned about the well-being of Her Majesty. That was why she hesitated at first. But Laria turned to the maid with her hand still on her cheek, and she was surprised because she actually realized the reason why the maid didn't want her to eat the meal in the beginning. The maid continued talking to Laria, and she was a little bit pissed because she actually cared about her. So she reminded her of the period when she went through a hard time when she was younger because of this particular allergic reaction. But it has disappeared ever since she stopped eating anything related to buckwheat. So she asked her what was exactly on her mind when she asked for this particular meal. So the maid held her hand and bowed her head, and she was a bit sad because she clearly knew that Her Highness Laria's mother was going to scold her for actually serving the galat meal to Laria, since she clearly knew the aftermath of giving Laria anything that contained buckwheat. So Laria went ahead to apologize to the maid, since it was clearly her fault after all. But immediately after she finished apologizing to the maid, she rather had a change in mood all of a sudden and told the maid that she should be rather more mindful next time so as not to make the same mistake. So as she sat on her bed with her long blonde hair, her two legs were wrapped around with a white blanket. Laria stayed there for a couple of minutes to think about what had just happened because she couldn't comprehend everything at all. As Laria was no longer comfortable sitting on the bed to think through, she finally decided to stand up and walk to the window side so as to get fresh air, and probably that will widen her thoughts. So with her long pink gown that had white ends, she walked towards the window. It quickly came to her that in the novel she had written, after the character Laria tormented the female lead character, She proceeded cheerfully to the Sherwood Estate rose garden, which had a lot of red roses growing there. So she stood there with her blonde hair and two blue diamond earrings on her ears. She then placed her hand beside her eye region and smiled as she danced alone in the garden. As she was at the window of her room, she placed her hand on the window and looked down to the ground. And she quickly noticed that there was no single rose growing where she thought it would have been growing as written in the novel. So everything felt a bit weird to her as to why things were just changing all of a sudden and not playing out as they should. Laria was still standing at the window with one hand still placed firmly on it, so she continued staring with her big blue eyes at the garden that didn't look like what was written in the novel. But since she was busy earlier trying to adapt to the new world, she didn't notice that there were really a lot of differences compared to the original novel. She suddenly turned away from the window, and she was not really happy about what she kept on uncovering, since at this point everything happened in a rather different sequence than she had expected, which made her a little vulnerable in this new world. It also meant that there are a series of possibilities that she may end up meeting the male lead character she wanted to avoid earlier on. But as she stood there, it finally occurred to her that her sudden end might be even closer than she had imagined, so she placed her two hands beside her cheek, and she felt a bit numb. Because the thought of her sudden end couldn't stop ringing inside her head, and that made her even more scared. Laria couldn't take any longer, as continuing to think and worry about her doom wouldn't bring any kind of solution, so it was better if she stopped being so negative and tried to think positively, even for once. Laria then decided to leave that state by walking away from the window to find something she could do to take her mind away from all those negative vibes. So she decided to walk towards where her wardrobe was, and she thought about looking for Laria's diary because it was obvious that any time she felt down, she would go and write down what she felt at that moment. And she said to herself that without the diary, it would be impossible for her to keep track of this current timeline and draw comparisons with any such. But once she comes across the said diary, she will be able to get a sense of what is happening and what might possibly happen after now. Laria bent down close to the wardrobe, and her big eyes were so fixed on the drawer that was below the wardrobe. She was rather eager to find the diary, as that was her only beacon of hope at this point in time, because everything else felt unreal and she couldn't take chances any longer. And since finding the diary was her only hope at this point, it will also go a long way in calming down the sudden anxiety that she had. So she kept her eyes directly inside the drawer in search of the diary. According to her, the diary should be somewhere inside this particular drawer because that's where Laria's other books were kept. But in no time, after so much resilience and determination, she finally found the diary she had been looking for. So she held the diary in her hand, and she was very happy she did find it because she believed its content would help her navigate through this new world without any fear of failure of any kind. Since she had already found the diary, she stood up from where she had bent down near the wardrobe as she heard a knock on the door. It was actually her maid, so she said to Lady Laria from outside that there was a guest waiting to meet with her. But since she wasn't expecting anyone at this time, she was rather surprised and turned to actually confirm if she heard the maid clearly. As she was still holding in her hand the diary that had a red cover on it, she was still in shock. And that made her open her mouth as she heard what the maid had to add after saying she had a visitor. The maid said that she was pretty sure that her job in the castle was to serve and cater for Lady Laria Sherwood. So why the sudden surprise from Her Majesty? The lady looked closed with her big blue eyes as she couldn't believe what she just heard again. Who was he actually referring to? So she asked the maid who she was actually referring to, and the maid went ahead to tell her that it was rather obvious that she was talking about the Grand Duke Blackwell. But Lady Laria wasn't taking it anymore, as it was just too unrealistic for her to believe what the maid revealed to her. So she wasted no time and went straight to open the diary on the table. Maybe it had more concrete detail that she could easily rely on, because she was pretty sure that the character Laria wasn't supposed to meet with Nocturne anytime soon, as she had written in the novel. So she flipped through the pages of the diary with her fingers carefully in order not to miss out on anything. Even the smallest detail was very important to her at this point in time. Laria placed the diary wide open on the table for a clearer view and easier reading, so she leaned with her two hands on the table with her long blonde hair that spread down to her waist region, and went straight to unveil the contents of the diary. She was still seated near the table with the diary still in front of her. She went ahead to start reading the same diary she had found earlier. It still felt unreal to her because of the chances of her escaping the torture of living in a house where no one actually understands her or acts like they do care about her. The diary says that her father, who always uses his work as an excuse not to spend quality time with his daughter, his father was not always around because of the nature of his work, but even when he had the choice of coming back home, he would probably give an excuse as to why he wouldn't make it. It was just a lot for her to take in because she didn't feel any love at all living in her own house. As she sat on the seat with her two hands crossed on her thigh and her head bowed down, she recalled how her family treated her. Was it her stepmother, Hillary, who she usually referred to as her own mother, who always finds fault in whatever she does, even the slightest mistake she was out to scold her? Or was it her elder brother, Norman, who wore a corporate dress with a book in hand and acts as if she doesn't even exist, and to add to that, her half-brother Adolf, who always pointed a finger at Laria to laugh at her when he pranks her? So she continued reading the content of the diary. It shows that the character Laria didn't feel loved in her own house. So the moment she found a silver lining of hope as she was seated while reading through a newspaper magazine in her hand, she came across a chance for her to leave her house since she didn't have anyone to lean on. In the newspaper magazine was an advertisement that stated that the Grand Duke Blackwell was actually looking for a maid in his home. The job was for her to take care of the children at the Duke's home. So she lifted up the newspaper magazine in the air, smiled, and said to herself that if only she could get a glimpse of the Grand Duke, she would finally have the perfect chance to leave her dreadful house. As she was still reading through the diary, she could picture how Laria was writing all these thoughts in her diary with a piece of quill in her hand. Although Laria had never taken care of a child before, she was rather ready to give it a try and find a way to work it out by any means. Laria added by saying, according to what was written in her diary, that she would hurry up and prepare a written resume and secretly have it delivered to the Grand Duke's house without anyone knowing it was actually from her. And if she could actually successfully carry that out, she prayed that she might find favor in Duke's sight so that he could save her from her life of despair. But as she stood with her long blonde hair and the diary in her hand, she couldn't possibly believe what she had just finished reading. There was no way she would have written all those in the novel. They didn't add up at all. So she held the diary closely to her face with both of her big blue eyes widely fixed on it. She stared at the content of the diary, and she didn't know how to comprehend everything because it was an entirely different story from what she had written in the novel. As she was still in her room reading through the diary, she suddenly heard a knock on the door, so she turned and wondered who was actually trying to disturb her at this time of the day. But it was actually her maid who called her from outside the room and said she wanted to start helping her prepare for the outing she had. She went ahead to usher the maid into the room, as she had requested. So the maid went straight to start applying the makeup to her face with a piece of white cotton cloth. She robbed Laria's face of makeup so that she could cover up the hives that were on the lady's face. But as she was still seated, the maid brushed her long blonde face. A thought suddenly came to her about the diary she had read. It was actually the moment Laria wanted to send back the carriage that was sent to her by the Grand Duke Blackwell's family. But if she went ahead to do that, her problems at that time would have gone bigger because she would be left with no choice but to meet with Nocturne. So she looked at the large mirror that was placed in her room so that she could check the makeup that had been done on her face. She was a bit lost in her thought as the content of the diary kept on ringing in her head. It was the part where Laria decided that she would rather just fail the interview and not get the job at the Duke's house and go ahead and face her problems at home. It was quite better that way. But as she was still in her room getting ready to go and meet the guest that had already been waiting for her, her family members had already welcomed the young man who wore a red princely garment, and they kept him entertained as they all laughed together. And immediately, when her stepmother saw her coming from afar, she stood up from where she was seated and walked towards where Laria was standing. But her older brother Norman stood there on his seat with his legs crossed and didn't say anything, as he has always done. Lady Laria stood and held her two hands together. She was a bit shy all of a sudden because she wasn't sure of what she would encounter during the course of her meeting the young man in red. Lady Laria stood with her beautiful blue gown, which was styled by her maid and had two long braided ropes that went down from her waist level to her knee level. She was dressed rather too gorgeous since she was meeting with an important person. She wanted to be in her best attire, so she was still standing there. She closed her eyes, bowed down her head a little, and apologized for keeping them waiting all this while. After that, she introduced herself as Laria Sherwood. But the gentleman in the red garment was a bit shocked the moment he saw Lady Laria, because she was looking so gorgeous that he did not even know the moment he opened his mouth wide and told her that he had been waiting for her for a while now. But he was rather dumbfounded by her beauty, and he couldn't hide it because it was quite obvious. Ladia's stepmother was rather quick to shut the gentleman in red out because she had actually been waiting to talk to her daughter as well. So she lifted up her hand in annoyance and told her that they should go and talk outside. But the gentleman was a bit shocked, as he didn't expect Mrs. Hilary to act that way. Hilary suddenly realized that what she had done was not right. So she turned to the gentleman in red attire and apologized to him, saying that she had something important that she wanted to say to her daughter. That was why she acted that way. The gentleman seated in red wasn't annoyed by what happened, he added, saying he didn't mind waiting a little bit longer. But Mrs. Hilary's son just stood there at her back and didn't say anything. He wasn't a man of many words. The guest in red attire was seated on the chair as he was waiting to meet with Lady Laria, so he placed his 2 hands on his thigh and looked around. And he felt a bit weird because he didn't want to interfere with the family dispute that was going on. So her stepmother ushered her out of the room because she wanted to ask something very important. So her elder brother accompanied them outside and stood behind his mother. As the two were facing Laria, she was a bit scared because she knew what she had done because the carriage from the Grand Duke had already arrived, and it clearly pointed out that she had a hidden agenda. Her stepmother went ahead to question her and ask her if she was really going to be interviewed as a maid. Since she was already caught red-handed, there was nothing left for her to say in order to prove that she was innocent at some point. So Laria bowed down to her in shame and closed her eyes, as she had a clue before that her being caught might actually happen. As the two stood before Laria, who was wearing a pink and black ribbon tied to her hair, her stepmother pointed a finger towards her. She was actually scolding her as usual and didn't wait for Laria to give her a tangible reason for what had transpired, but Laria actually didn't know how she would start explaining everything to her stepmother. Laria summoned courage and she went straight to disagree with her stepmother by saying she wasn't wrong at any point, so there was no need for her to be cautious of what might happen afterwards. She told her stepmother that it was just her usual way of worrying too much and nothing else, but her stepmother didn't take what she said as a tangible excuse to give, as she expected nothing but. So she stared at Laria angrily and told her that as the only daughter of her father, she should be dedicated to the house and serving food, among other chores. So her stepmother stood and continued yelling at Laria because she wasn't impressed at all by her daughter's behavior. Her elder brother also stood in front of Laria and wanted to put in his own opinion about the issue, when Laria suddenly answered and said that they shouldn't fault her like that because she was actually working towards improving herself more. But her elder brother couldn't take it anymore, as he had always wanted to say something on the matter. So he folded his hands and angrily said to Laria that at least, even if she was going to take such a decision, she should have discussed it with the whole family instead of hastily going to do what was on her mind. But Laria responded by saying it was not like they even genuinely cared about her. They were rather being overly protective. So Laria went ahead to pull the sleeve of her beautiful dress to show her elder the effects of the allergic reaction she had earlier on. And even when she had eaten the food that contained a little amount of buckwheat, she didn't seem to care if she was all right or not. He rather just turned away his face and continued eating his own meal. As she was still holding her arm out with the rashes that formed on her arm because of the allergic reaction caused by the galette she had eaten, Laria smiled and said to her elder brother that even after he had seen the state of her skin, was he even ready to help her out? But Norman, Laria's elder brother, didn't seem to be bothered by the rash that appeared on his sister's arm. At this point, one will be thinking that he kind of hated his younger sister. So as the lady with long blonde hair was still holding her affected arm with both eyes closed, because she couldn't believe that her brother would have reacted that way, her brother added by saying that even with what happened to her, it still wasn't her right to take the kind of decision she took. The guest who wore red attire couldn't help but wonder what had been happening all this while he had been waiting to interview Laria. So he held a cup of coffee in his hand and stood up, before he overheard the conversion between Blackwell's family. And that made him a little bit scared, as he didn't want to make any mistake of any kind because he didn't want to be disgraced by Laria's stepmother, Mrs. Hillary. Since they had all doubted her, both her stepmother and elder brother went ahead to tell them that since they had concluded that she was lacking the ability to comport herself, she assured them that they had nothing to worry about considering the fact that she would fail the interview anyway. As the two were still staring at her, she decided to go back into the room where the interviewer was and act like everything was normal. As she was about to open the door to enter the room, she turned her back with her long blonde hair that reached her waist level towards her stepmother and elder brother, and said to them that what she meant by all that she said earlier was that they shouldn't care or be surprised about anything she ends up doing. As they were all heading towards where the interviewer was, her stepmother and elder brother stood before the stairs and watched as Laria walked down the stairs to go and meet the interviewer, who wore red princely attire. But the interviewer couldn't wait any longer, so he told Blackwell's family that he would have to come another time when it was more convenient for them. But Laria smiled very hard with her pretty face and long blonde hair that went down to her shoulder level, and she said to herself that if she could successfully pass the interview, her family members would start respecting her and treating her in a sensible manner. Her half-brother Adolf suddenly went in front of Laria as she was coming down from the stairs and spread his arms to block her as she was about to pass, and he also tried to make her fall as he was not able to stop her from walking from the room. But Adolf didn't seem to have understood what was going on with Laria, so he called her Pumpkin, the name he usually uses when he wants to tease her, and asked her if she was actually leaving the house as she walked past him, or if she was annoyed that he tripped her as she was walking down the stairs. Laria wasn't quite ready for any drama between her and her half-brother, so she ignored him completely and went straight to where the interviewer, who wore a red dress, was and stood beside him. So he opened his mouth and asked Laria where she was actually going all by herself, and he wondered why he had not heard anything from her since she left the room. But she rather laughed very hard as he asked her that question. So as she stood in front of the interviewer with her long blonde hair, she then went ahead to apologize to him for keeping him waiting all this while. But the man in red wasn't actually annoyed at all. Even though she had kept him waiting for so long, he only smiled back at her. Laria's half-brother Adolf still didn't give a breathing space as he was still standing in front of her, trying to prevent her from going outside. So she turned to him angrily and said to him that why didn't wait when she was in a playful state for him to come and start teasing her all of a sudden? Because with this annoying behavior, he had already made their guest uncomfortable. Adolf was still standing in front of Laria with both of his hands spread widely because he wanted to block her from going out. And the guest in red that stood behind him was a bit shocked, because how would he be trying to waste his precious time after all the delays that had been made earlier on? So Laria was a bit pissed, so she held her bag in her hand and went straight to walk out of the room. But Laria was so determined and didn't want anything to stop her from going to the interview, so she walked past and ignored Adolf without being bothered by what he was saying. So Adolf stood there and turned in surprise that his half-sister could be bold enough to have pushed him and passed. They all stood in shock as they watched as she boldly walked out of the house. Laria's stepmother placed her hand on her mouth and couldn't say anything because she always saw her daughter as a shy person and didn't expect her to be bold enough to walk out on them. In no time, she had already entered the Grand Duke's mansion, and as she entered the room, she was ushered to where he was seated. So Laria went ahead to hand over her resume to him, so the Grand Duke crossed his legs as he held the resume in one of his hands while sitting on a red couch and going through the information written in the resume. So as they were both seated together in his office with cups of coffee placed in front of either of them, he went ahead to ask her to confirm if her name was actually Laria Sherwood. So she responded by saying yes, that was her name, and she also added by saying that she is 19 years of age, the second child in her family, and also the oldest daughter. The Grand Duke, who wore his princely garment, held his own cup of coffee and was drinking as he applauded Laria for coming all the way to his mansion, because she rather came from a far distance, all in the name of searching for a job in his mansion. She was indeed determined on passing the interview and getting the job. But Laria placed her hand on her chin and laughed after hearing what the Duke had to say and said to herself that it was rather funny to her if anyone was given such an invitation to be interviewed by the Duke and the person would reject such an offer. So she replied to the Duke by saying he shouldn't bother himself by worrying her because he sent a quite nice carriage to convey her here, so that made it possible for her to have a comfortable ride. Laria stared at the Duke with her big blue eyes because she was rather excited that she was there in the mansion. It was a bit of a privilege to be able to meet with the male lead character of the novel she wrote. The Grand Duke, who had his fine purple eyes fixed on Laria's resume as he held it up and read through it because he was a bit intrigued by knowing her better. But as they were seated today, Laria was a bit shy to look directly at the Duke, so she turned away her face and looked in the opposite direction because he was just too handsome that she couldn't keep eye contact. Since she didn't want to make everything a bit weird, she tried her best to avoid staring at him as he stood with his legs crossed and the resume in his hand while facing in her direction. Laria, who was also a beautiful and lovely girl with her big blue eyes and long blonde hair, should rather be the one who would be a bit shy because of her beauty, but it was quite the other way around as she turned away from looking in his direction. The Grand Duke suddenly noticed that Laria was actually trying to avoid his face by turning in the other direction, so he was a bit confused because he didn't know her reason for doing that. So he stared at her strangely and suspected her a little. But as he couldn't keep up with the suspense between the two of them, and since he was done reading the resume, he proceeded to tell Laria that he had finished reading the resume she sent over to him. She was tensed because of the tone of voice he used to say he was done, so she was a bit scared as she placed both hands on her thigh and stared at him, as she didn't know what to expect after that. Everything changes all of a sudden the minute the Duke places Laria's resume on the table and turns to her to say something. So as he was still seated on the red couch, he went ahead to tell Laria that what she had written in her resume was no different from trash, but it was a bit strange because he had taken his time to read through her resume. So what might he have seen to make him say such a statement? As Laria was still seated on the red couch with her long blonde hair that had a black and white ribbon tied behind it, she was tensed the minute she heard the Duke say that her resume was similar to trash, and that made her stutter as she was answering him. So she went ahead and asked him what actually made him think of her resume as trash. The Duke placed one of his hands by his head as he leaned towards the left side, and he immediately picked up the resume in his right hand to explain to Laria what made him think that way. He then asked her why she included things like attending sewing classes or tea parties. Her work description here in the mansion is only to look after the children and nothing else, so adding all those was not necessary. The Duke continued by saying that he actually called Laria here because he thought she could at least be able to work hard and cater well for the children in the mansion. But at this point, judging from what he had read in her resume and observed in her physically, even the house chores might be even too much for her to do. So Laria placed her head down with both of her hands crossed together as he was saying all this. She was quite ashamed at this point. Even after saying all that, the Duke was not really finished with what he had to say about Laria, so he added by saying that rather than her comforting a child when he or she is crying, she should likely be the one crying instead. The Duke was rather harsh with his words towards Laria, and that made her less confident about herself, so she kept her head down as she was seated on the couch and couldn't even look up. As Laria was still seated, she suddenly had a flashback to when she worked as a preschool teacher, so she pictured herself seated on a wooden chair in front of 3 children. She raised her hands in the air as she was teaching the children that stood before her, because before she actually came to the Dukes in search of a job, she taught in a preschool and took care of over 10 children at once, in a single classroom all by herself without any difficulty. The 2 Duke's children, one a boy and the other a girl, were all dressed up in their royal apparel as they were all curious to meet their new nanny since their father was talking about employing a new one. Even though it was just 2 children that were in the Duke's palace, she couldn't still say out loud that she had experience taking care of little children, although the Duke had downgraded her by saying she wasn't quite fit for this particular job. So she stood and stared bashfully. She held her dress as she wasn't able to control herself, as it was too much for her to handle because she was actually very good at this particular job. But she didn't want to complicate things. If at the end she finally got the job, it would be a bit weird. So at this point she had no choice but to act like someone who didn't know anything concerning taking care of little children. So Laria decided to mask everything out by smiling and acting cool, held her hand by her cheek, smiled hard with her mouth open, and suggested to the Duke that, who knows, if she worked hard and showed she was serious, everything would then work as he had wanted. But the Duke didn't buy any of that, as his face was not smiling at all, so he said to her that what she just suggested was rather a childish thought. The Duke stood up from the red couch on which he was seated, fed up with hearing anything that Laria had to say because she didn't sound convincing. So he told her that there was rather nothing more to see from her. She should please head back to the carriage as the interview was over. But Laria was a bit shocked as she was still seated on the red couch and couldn't believe what the Duke had to say to her. The Duke added by saying that since she must have been tired because she came a bit far just for the interview, she should rather please go to the reception room and rest a bit before she finally goes. She was rather surprised that the Duke would have dismissed her a bit more suddenly than expected. So she opened, as she was still shocked and couldn't comprehend all that he had said. How would she come all the way to the mansion and go back without getting the job she wanted? It was a bit heartbreaking because her family at home would gladly laugh at her for not getting the job, as they had warned her not to go in the first place. Since her fake character wasn't detected at all by the Duke, she was a bit happy because it was actually part of her plan. So Laria lifted up her fist in the air and smiled as she walked away from the Duke's office to the reception room. As the maid stood by the door with her hand on her chest, as she stood and waited to usher Laria to where she was supposed to go, she stood and pondered within herself and said that the Duke Nocturne actually didn't show like he was a bit interested in her, so she doesn't think there is any sort of romantic cliché of him being obsessed with her, and that made her even happier, because it was as she had planned. She walked behind the maid that was supposed to take her to the reception and smiled as she followed because she couldn't help but picture how her life would actually be. Laria pictured herself sitting under an umbrella on the beach with a drink in her hand as she relaxed and enjoyed herself. It was actually her ideal bright future, and she couldn't wait to start living it. The maid in a black and white dress was still in front as she led that way through the corridor to the reception room, and Laria followed her behind with her long blonde hair as she continued thinking of what had happened earlier on. She was still happy because it went on even better than she had thought it would, and she said to herself that she shouldn't have worried in the first place. As they were still in the corridor in the mansion, Laria couldn't help but think that she actually heard the voice of a child as they walked through, so she immediately stopped and turned to confirm if what she heard was actually a child's voice. So she stood there and listened carefully because she kept hearing the same voice over and over again. So Laria stood and stared at one of the rooms where the child's voice was coming from. She heard someone saying, "Stop crying, Prince," so she went close to it. "If you make a mistake, you must learn not to do it again. You must get it in your head." So Laria stood by the door to really understand what was actually going on. The lady with long blonde hair and big blue eyes couldn't help it anymore because the words coming from the room were rather harsh to be said to a little child. And that made her shed a tear because she clearly knew that someone at the door was actually maltreating one of the children in the mansion. So she took to her heels, as she wanted to get to the room as soon as possible since the crying that came from the room didn't seem to have stopped. So as she was still doing that, the maid who was taking her to the reception room suddenly noticed that Laria was running in the other direction, so she turned and shouted at her, trying to call her back. But Laria at this point wanted to make sure that the boy crying from inside the room was okay, so as she stood by the door to open it, she was a bit confused. She actually didn't know exactly what was happening in the Duke's house. There were too many unknown and creeping things that happened, and she wanted to uncover all of them. So she held the handle of the door and opened it wide open to actually see what was happening inside the room because the suspense was too much. And she didn't care if she was trespassing on anyone's privacy by forcefully opening the door. The child's was rather more important than that. The moment Laria opened the door wide open, she was a bit surprised by what she just uncovered because it was rather unbelievable. She saw the two Duke's children on the floor, holding each other as the girl was trying to console her brother, who was still sobbing on the floor, and there was also another lady in a long dress that stood beside them. At this point, Laria was rather shocked to her bones, as she couldn't comprehend all that she had seen in the room, so she opened her big blue eyes to see clearly if what she could see in the room was actually happening, or if it was just her imagination. So she immediately turned to confront the other lady that was in the room. She held a long whip in her hand and was about to swing it in the little boy's direction when Laria asked her what she was actually doing. The lady was actually dressed like a maid because she wore a black skirt with a dark blue top that had buttons that ran from the top to the bottom of the shirt. But Laria couldn't take it anymore as the lady that stood in the room didn't seem to have even noticed that she entered, as she was still holding the whip in her hand, ready to continue beating the little child, so she went ahead to stay in front of the two children with her hands spread so as to prevent the lady from touching any of them. The lady in black rather laughed the moment she saw what Laria demonstrated, so she quickly asked her who she was to have had that audacity to barge into the room and even tried to stop her from scolding the children. Laria was so confident at this point with her big blues widely open that she was rather pissed that the lady would ask her something like that. So she looked straight into the lady's eye and told her that she was Laria Sherwood, and she came to the Duke's mansion to be interviewed for the job of the maid. But the other lady with dark hair was expecting that Laria would be someone of a reputable position to have stopped her in that matter, while she was just a mere lady looking for a job as a maid in the palace. So she gave her a staring look and responded to her with the whip in her hand by saying that she is just an outsider who doesn't even know anything about how the palace operates. So what really came over to block the teacher of the Grand Duchy? The lady in the black dress looked rather pissed because Laria wasn't even in a position to interfere with her job, so she held the whip in her right hand and faced Laria, ready to pour out her anger on her. But Laria immediately had to explain to her by pointing out her hand towards the two little children that were on the floor and saying that at this point, it didn't matter if she was an outsider or not. The children's safety was most important because they must be very terrified right now because of what had happened. The little boy held his right hand, which was really bleeding because of the whip that was used on him by the Grand Duchy's teacher. He was in severe pain that made him shed tears as he was on the ground. How could someone be so cruel like that? And at this point, it didn't matter what level of offense he might have committed. He didn't deserve this kind of punishment. So Laria bent down towards where the little child was sobbing, and she asked him if he was all right or not, because it all seemed as if he was really in so much pain. So the little boy turned to her while still holding his injured hand and said he was not all right at all because all his fingers were throbbing as a result of the pain inflicted by the whip. So Laria held the little boy's hand to examine it very well, as there were stains of blood on his finger, and it had already started swelling. Because from what she saw on the child's hand, it was rather too much pain for a little child, no matter the level of offense he had committed. So she asked the Grand Duchy's teacher whether the little boy was punished for spilling tea, or if there was more that she didn't know. As she couldn't take it anymore since the little boy was seriously bleeding and was going through a lot of pain, she carried the boy up, who still had hand stains of blood in his hand, so she lifted him with both hands and said to herself that before they could proceed with anything, the little boy had to receive treatment first. But it all seemed like the Grand Duchy's teacher didn't buy the idea of taking the little boy away, so she spread her hands and stood before Laria, trying to block them from entering the room. As the little boy was still in Laria's arm, the lady that stood in front of them asked her where she was actually taking the little boy. But how could someone be so heartless to the point that he or she didn't care if the little one was in so much pain or not? So as Laria still had the little boy in her arms, she responded to the Grand Duchy's teacher that she was obviously taking the little boy for treatment since the boy was still crying because of the pain in his fingers. But the Grand Duchy's teacher had a rather hardened heart to the extent that she cared at all about the child's well-being, even though she was his assigned tutor in the palace. She actually bent on not allowing Laria to take away the boy just because of a minor injury. According to her, she would rather the little boy recognize his wrongdoing and apologize that he wouldn't do it again than treat him at that moment. As she was still standing in front of Laria, who held the little boy in her arms, the Grand Duchy's teacher was rather determined on proving her own point by not allowing the boy to leave the room. And that made Laria pissed, seeing that it was not right for a tutor to just ignore a little child after he has been injured, all in the name of discipline. She should at least show sympathy to the injured child, but the Grand Duchy's teacher responded by saying that it wasn't something an outsider should be concerned about because it was actually none of her business. And that rather made Laria so furious because how could someone be so cruel to the extent of not caring at all? So she said to herself that the tutor only acted that way because the little boy wasn't her biological child. That must be the reason she didn't care at all. Since the tutor didn't want to allow Laria, who was still carrying the little boy in her arms, to leave the room, Laria decided to figure out a way that they could both be satisfied at least. She suggested to the tutor that she should go get her the first aid kit so that the little boy could be given first aid treatment because they could all figure out what next to do because if he didn't receive any treatment at this point, it might be something they wouldn't be able to control. But unknown to them, the noise they have been making from arguing with each other was clearly heard from the other rooms in the palace. So they were rather surprised to see the Grand Duke barge into the room the moment he heard Laria say that if the little child didn't receive treatment, something bad might happen. Immediately after the Grand Duke entered the room, he asked the two ladies in the room what they meant by get treatment. The Grand Duke stood by the door with his hand in the air and told the two ladies that he rushed to the room because the maid outside the room came and told him that there was a bit of commotion happening in the children's room that seemed a bit tense, so he came to see if everything was all right. But the Duke didn't quite understand what was actually happening in the room because he saw the little boy in Laria's arms who seemed to be injured, and the two ladies were rather busy arguing instead of finding a way to treat him, so he stared at them strangely. So as Laria was still carrying the little boy on her arms, the Duke has to say that at this point, treating the little boy was rather more important than looking into the matter of the commotion that happened earlier. He then ordered them to head over to the medical room as suggested by Laria. In no time, they had all reached the medical room, and the three stood from afar as they watched the physician as he administered the treatment to the little boy. But as they brought the boy into the room and the physician was about to examine the boy, he said they were rather lucky to have brought the little boy here as soon as they did, because it would have been a different story entirely. The physician held the little boy's hand as they were seated at his desk, and said that they had no cause to worry since he had been treated before and the blisters would only form without any scarring. The moment the physician finished assuring them that the little one would be fine, Laria had a bit of relief as she placed her hand on her chest and thanked God that the Duke came in earlier enough to intervene and allow her to bring the child to the medical room. She was rather scared and worried about the little boy. So Laria stood and was really happy that the little boy was all right, although she masked everything by acting cool and not showing her excitement. She rather kept a straight face, her big blue eyes, and long blonde hair. She stared around, hoping they wouldn't notice a thing. But immediately after that, the Duke called the attention of Laria, as he didn't forget what actually went down that made them bring the little boy to the medical room. The Duke turned towards Laria and told her that it was rather inappropriate for someone who was just here as a guest to be intervening with the internal affairs of the palace. They would still have to provide a proper explanation for what had transpired. So as they all stood together in the medical room, the Duke stood in between the palace tutor and Laria with his hands folded, as he was ready to start hearing the explanations they both had to give. Indeed, the tutor used the name of education as an excuse to continuously torment the children in the Duke's palace. As Laria stood beside the Duke as they were in the medical room, she was quick to recall that the Duke didn't give the tutor any right or instructions to hurt the children in any way, because even from the way he responded, he actually cared about the well-being of the little boy, even though he left them under the care of someone else. The little boy's name was Mikhail, and his sister's name was Janet. They both stood together, but it was a bit strange that the two children in the Duke's palace were not actually his biological children. But the young Duke Nocturne wasn't quite a lover of children. He rather hated them, and that was the main reason he wanted to hire a maid to work in his palace. He was so committed to his work that he didn't have time for children or even think of raising his own children because he was always dressed in his princely garment with a stick in his hand, as his priority at the moment was career over family. The moment after the death of Nocturne's father, who was actually the biological father of both Mikhail and Janet, was a bit tragic because his mother also passed away, as well as she gave birth to the twins. Nocturne stood by his mother's bedside as she gave birth and died after it was just too much for him to handle because he lost both of his parents in almost the same period. As there was no one to take care of the two children who were literally his siblings, he was rather the only one left to cater for the twins. The twins held the Duke's fingers with their hands as they were stuck with him forever, as he became literally their father. But since the nature of his work couldn't allow him to spend quality time with the twins, he was unable to see them often, nor was it even possible for him to treat them kindly. Nevertheless, he didn't let that stop him from taking care of them as his own children at any chance he had to do so, and as a result of that, he rather made them feel like they were his own family. As the Duke stood with his hands folded in between arms and stared strangely at Laria, she was rather quick to conclude to say something funny about the Duke. She said that if he was actually Nocturne, he wouldn't turn a blind eye to what she was about to say to him. He would somewhat believe it, but she was scared he wouldn't. Laria was not quite sure of how she would answer the Duke, as he was impatient and wanted to know what had transpired between her and the tutor that landed the little boy in the medical room. So she placed her hand on her chest and apologized to the Duke for the commotion she might have caused in the palace. But Laria also added by saying that the only reason she went into the room was because she overheard a child crying from inside. So as the tutor was standing next to the Duke, she was a bit scared that Laria would mention the part where she actually saw her using a whip on the little children. As the Duke gave Laria a staring look, she was left with no choice but to say that she saw the tutor using a whip on the little boy, so she had to intervene by stopping her. But the tutor would rather find Laria funny, so she laughed at Laria the moment she accused her of using violence on the little child. And so she responded by saying she must have been raised as a spoiled brat, and she lacked the experience of taking care of children since she is also young. The tutor added by saying that she might just misunderstand this type of discipline as violence because she clearly wasn't skilled enough. As the tutor was still confidently claiming that she was only teaching an appropriate lesson to the little boy, and not as Laria had perceived it, Laria suddenly turned in her direction, and she was shocked at how a person would be so corny to the point of making it look as if she were the clueless and unaware person who didn't know anything about harsh reality. So the tutor added by explaining to the Duke that the method she was using had a rather immediate effect. Although it hurts a bit, it was rather more efficient, and the children would definitely want to run away from the situation because of the pain, but it was worth it anyway. At this point, it all seemed as if the Duke believed what the tutor had been saying because they were all facing her and stared at her suspiciously as if she were the one at fault. And Laria said to herself that since she didn't write anything about child education in her novel, it might just be how this new world probably perceived things and it didn't bother them at all. The tutor also said that if a child goes through horrendous punishment and it continues to happen repeatedly, the child won't be able to realize what he did wrong. The child will rather find ways of escaping, but what she believes was right was just a hit or two at the moment, which will be effective as the discipline will grow gradually as time goes on. But Laria turned to the tutor with her hands in the air and said that definitely, after all is done, in the end, those experiences will rather be bad influences on the children's emotions. The Duke placed his hand under his chin as he reasoned what the two ladies had said, and it all points out that what the tutor said was rather more convincing than Laria's own side of the story. So Laria stood directly in front of the Duke and prayed that he might be by her side and understand everything she had explained. Laria was a bit shocked to hear the Duke say that it was rather hard for him to agree with everything she had to say about everything, and that suddenly changed Laria's facial expression because she wasn't really expecting that kind of reply from the Duke. So she stared at him with her big blue eyes to see if maybe he was just messing with her. But he was rather serious because he added by saying that Molly was an outstanding tutor, and judging from her career background, she has raised many exceptional children of nobility, and there is no one who could question her professionalism. So the tutor held her two hands and smiled mischievously as the Duke applauded her for her reputable career background. The Grand Duke stood with his hand folded as he tried to find out the truth between both the tutor, Molly, and Laria, who stood in front of him with her long blonde hair. The Grand Duke quickly pointed out to Laria that he could now clearly see where her concern and worries about the little child were coming from, but with the knowledge and trust that he had in the tutor who stood beside him, he wouldn't ever doubt Molly's judgment and wouldn't believe that with the level of expertise that she had, she couldn't make such a novice mistake. The Duke then stood with his well-trimmed hair and princely garment that had a blue diamond around his neck region and stared at Laria while he added by saying to her that, frankly speaking, he didn't see anything wrong in Molly's method of correcting the little child because from time to time a child should be given light strikes and etiquette lessons so as to instill morals in the child. As the three were still discussing amongst themselves, they all suddenly turned when the medical personnel who treated the little child brought to their attention the present condition of the child. So as they all turned in his direction, he quickly apologized for interrupting their conversation, but it was a matter of urgency that they pay close attention to what he had to say. The physician held the little child in his arms as he conveyed the health condition of the little child. He added by saying that although the little child's injury wasn't that severe, he rather had scars from previous beatings on his body, which could only imply that the young lord had suffered maltreatment from whoever took care of him. With his large glasses on his face, The physician jokingly said that if he were going to be in the shoes of the child, he would have run away long ago since he fully knew that he was going to be punished this way. The little child held the physician closely to himself as he lay his body on his chest. The scars from the beatings could be clearly seen on the little child's hand. The physician then said to the Duke, "Don't you think this method of correction was rather merciless? Because the only offense the child committed was failing to hold a teacup properly and nothing more." Laria quickly went close to the physician to actually see the scars on his hand, and she was shocked because she hadn't noticed them earlier on. But as she continued staring at the little child with her long blonde hair, Molly, with her black and white long dress, quickly came and said that the only reason she beat the child was because he wanted to run away after being wrong. But the Grand Duke stood and stared at the little child with so much compassion, which he never showed considering the fact that the child was technically his own. As he stood, the physician brought the child's hand close to him so that he could confirm the scars and level of maltreatment he passed through. And didn't His Highness find this to be a really serious issue? As the Duke stood and pondered what next to do, a scary image of his late father suddenly came to his head while he heard a voice saying that he must set aside any emotions that may cloud his judgment. He must rather live up to the Blackwell name. The Duke stood with his head slightly bent down as the voice continued to sound in his head, and he heard another saying, which was that he needed to prove his purity, if not for anything, for the sake of his family. He placed his hand on his head, as he couldn't control the pain that came along with the loud voices in his head. So the Duke unknowingly said that this definitely had to stop while he came back to his senses after being lost in his thoughts. The Duke then suddenly ordered his other maid, Fredika, to tell her that she should go and take the children to their rooms. So she went straight to the physician, who was still holding the little child in his arms, to collect the child from him as instructed by the Grand Duke. He then turned and faced the tutor and angrily told her that she might leave today. The Duke added by saying that she is now restrained from giving any further penalties until Mikhail's, the little child's, injury has healed. So Molly stood with her head bowed down as she was ashamed of her actions and calmly answered His Majesty by saying she would adhere to everything. Laria stood with her long blonde hair, and she was a bit shaking in a little fear because the Duke was about to address her. The Duke suddenly turned to Laria, whose mouth was now open, and stared around in fear. He told her that he wouldn't ask her to take responsibility for the commotion she caused earlier because she was indeed looking out for Mikhail, and so she should quietly be on her way home. But as they all walked out of the room, the physician walked with Mikhail in his arms as he was accompanied by the maid, while Laria, in her white gown and long blonde hair, who stood close to the tutor, quietly asked, "How was this situation just going to be wrapped up without actually fixing anything?" But as the two worked past each other, they suddenly bumped into one another as Molly smiled mischievously. The tutor, with her long black hair, quickly said to Lariat, "What would someone do to the stress of getting worked up over nothing?" She was rather snooping around where she was not needed. But Lariat didn't answer a word as she stood with her long blonde hair and wondered in shock. Lariat suddenly turned the moment she heard what the tutor had to say about her. So as she turned with her long blonde hair, Laria stared at her, wondering what would actually prompt her to say what she said earlier, considering the fact that the tutor was very wrong and Laria only wanted to help. Does this mean Molly now hates her? She stood and kept asking herself these questions. As the physician had now reached the children's room, he stood by the door with the little child on his arm. With his pair of glasses still placed on his eyes, he calmly said to Mikhail's sister that they can now go ahead and enter their various rooms, and as she kept staring at her brother that was on the physician's arm, he then quickly pointed out to her that her brother was actually traumatized by what happened earlier on. Mikhail was still on the physician's arm and overheard what they both spoke about. The little child with the bandage still placed on his arm, who was still in pain, tried to open his eyes as tears suddenly poured out. The physician then pointed out to the children that everyone else may think what he did might have been nosy, but he was just doing his job. Laria then stood as she was still in the Duke's mansion and was about to leave when it suddenly occurred to her why she didn't hesitate to help Mikhail, who had been beaten by his tutor. So she stood with long blonde hair and her hand placed on her chest as she thought about how she couldn't bear to watch the child get hit. She could clearly understand Mikhail's tear because she suddenly remembered when she was around the little child's age, when she experienced something alike. The man held a whip in his hand and stretched it behind his back as he was about to hit Laria. He said to her, why was she looking at him that way when she clearly knew she was wrong? And because of the strength he used while whipping her, scars could be clearly seen on Laria's legs. She then remembered when she was young and was living as Nam Ju-hyun, which was her name until she came into this new world. She recalled the nights when she lay in a room in pain and was not consoled because there weren't any adults around to help her out. She lay on the bed and cried bitterly as Mikhail earlier did, because she was left with no option but to endure the pain. She went and suffered in silence. So she lay her head on the bed with tears running down her cheek as she sobbed, and her hand also had scars that came from the beating. Nam Ju-hyun, who is now Laria, stood up in her room and wondered why she actually had to live like this. As she stood, the scars from her hands down to her calf region could be clearly seen. It was rather too hard and painful for a little child to pass through all this, and so she said to herself that at this point she despise and hate the person who treated her that way. She then stood with her long blonde hair that had a purple ribbon attached to it. With her hand folded, she all of a sudden felt a bit guilty, with her eyes looking weary. Nam Ju-hyun said that if there was anyone Mikhail should blame for what befell him, it should be her, because she is the writer of this particular novel that she was reincarnated into. Nam Ju-hyun suddenly remembered when she picked up her ink pen and created all the characters in her novel, and according to her, she was the genesis of all the misfortune that had happened and will happen in this current world she now lives in. Because, according to what was written in the novel, Laria was destined to become a villainess, Mikhail and his sister were destined to suffer, and Nocturne, the Duke, was also destined to live in utter misery. Laria then placed her hand on her chest. As she thought about all this in her head, she stood with her long blonde hair that covered her eyes and couldn't stop thinking of what she actually used her hand to do. Because seeing the pain and suffering of the characters that she created with her own two eyes overwhelms her with a lot of guilt. She then turned her back with her long blonde hair that had a beautiful ribbon tied at the back, as it suddenly occurred to her that her being here might actually be God's hand, which he sent her in order to finish up her incomplete mess of a novel and maybe change how the story ends to give them a happy ending. And the affirmation gave Laria the courage to defer what the Duke said earlier on about her leaving the mansion. So she decided to look for the room where the Duke was, and the moment she located it, she barged in with so much confidence as she held the handle of the door with her long blonde hair flying sides. She spoke to the Duke, saying His Majesty should please give her audience a chance to say what was actually on her mind. But the Duke didn't seem as if he really heard what Laria had said, because he could clearly remember when he told her to be on her way home since his services were not needed at this moment, and seeing her barge in like that left him in so much surprise that he didn't utter a word. Laria then placed her hand on her chest with her green eyes widely open as she added by saying to the Duke that she can't possibly go back like this with so much guilt in her heart, even though she may have failed the interview that actually brought her here, and knew that he should rather consider that any attention she had was clearly pure and nothing more, so he should please accept her as the maid for those kids. The Duke suddenly turned as he was standing near the window in the room and stared towards Laria after hearing what she said, and he responded to her by saying that her memory is bad for her to be asking him such a thing. She rather heard clearly when he said that it was the end of the matter and he had no more reasons to hire her. He rephrased to Laria what she said while he was interviewing her for the job, because in the job description he was looking for someone he could entrust the safety of his children to. The Duke placed his hand around his head with Laria's resume in his hand and asked her why she would include things like sewing classes or tea parties in her resume while her job was to look after the children. Laria quickly walked towards where Duke was standing near the window with her long blonde hair as she held her beautiful dress with her two hands. And she said that, judging from the fact that the children's father was well-grounded, she didn't expect their education to be lacking in any way, to the point that she thought she wasn't needed as a maid. But the aftermaths were quite different. But her thought was actually wrong because the children were definitely passing through hell even while living in this mighty mansion. Laria suddenly remembered when the little boy was injured as he held his wounded hand and cried. So she added by saying that who would have thought that the Duke's child, even though not his biological child, would ever pass through such pain at the hands of his own tutor. Laria then boldly faced the Duke, who was standing in front of her in his princely attire that even had a diamond engraved on his inner shirt. So as she stood with her long blonde hair that had a ribbon tied behind it, she stared directly into the Duke's eyes and said to him that this mansion actually needs her. As she stood, Laria placed her hand on her cheek and smiled as she used the Duke's words against her, because he had earlier said to her that she rather had a bad memory. While he was the same person who irresponsibly said, according to her, that if I work hard, then won't it all work out somehow, had he forgotten all of a sudden? Why doesn't he want to give her a chance to prove herself? But it again hit Laria as she was still standing, saying that the Duke was right after all because even though she was a preschool teacher in her past life, it wasn't that certain that she could possibly prove that she possessed all those qualities of catering for children now that she is Laria. With her hand wrapped around her arms and long blonde hair that went down her chest region, Laria said within herself that she had now lost faith by saying that there was no reason why she should be hired. She then recalled the moment she sat while writing the novel with a pen in her hand, and also the book in which she wrote everything. Laria was just so lost in thought as she kept on wondering things, one of which was when she reasoned if it was possible to turn Nocturne's heart, the Duke, considering the fact that she was actually the author of the novel. The occurrences here should rather be at her pace. As they both stood by the window side, which had tall green shrubs that grew outside the window, Laria's eyes were still fixed on the Duke because she still wanted to prove her point. So as she held her hands together, she calmly said to the Duke that coming from someone who knows firsthand how painful abuse is, he was rather handling the situation quite passively and without much concern. And immediately when the Duke heard the words that came out of the mouth of Laria, he became pissed all of a sudden. Because how would someone who was in search of a job in his mansion have the audacity to be talking to him in such a matter? So he stared at her in so much dismay while still being in shock at the level of courage she had. As they both stood close to each other, with one of his shoes raised as he walked towards Laria, who stood in her long blue gown, the Duke pointed out to Laria that he was actually wondering where all of her confidence came from, but he clearly saw that she must have just foolishly repeated what she heard from somewhere else. But Laria became scared all of a sudden because of the way the Duke moved towards her. It was rather intense and matched with what he just asked her, which was if she was trying to threaten him. So with so much fear, Laria stepped back as she opened her mouth and was about to scream when the Duke attempted to do something she never thought he would ever do. The Duke moved rather too close towards Laria while trying to prove his point, and that actually made her scared to the point where she started sweating. The Duke then stood with his hand placed on the wall close to Laria as he cornered her, stared directly into her eyes, and gave her a stern warning because of how she arrogantly talked to him. He then added, "Why don't he just kill her right here and now?" And those words actually rendered Lariato shaking in fear. But he clearly did that to tease Laria and instill a small fear in her, because he definitely didn't mean he was going to kill her. So as he was staying facing her as his shadow could be clearly seen on the wall, she stared back at him and said within herself that, as expected, she knew he would sensitively be talking about his past abuse and be on guard. But she could still turn everything around and convince him because she clearly had a lovable character and knew his flaws, considering the fact that she wrote the novel. Laria was a bit surprised that the Duke suddenly changed his mood in a twinkle of an eye after having threatened her earlier on. His hand was still placed on the wall as his shadow also reflected on the wall while facing Laria. The Duke said to her that, judging by her response, what she said might actually be true, but Laria just stood in shock after hearing everything without saying anything. She stared back into his eyes. But the Duke wasn't bluffing, as Laria had thought that he might have been. He rather looked too serious as he stared at her. With his purple eyes and in his principal apparel that had a blue diamond placed on the tie region, he said to Laria that seeing that she remained expressionless when she saw the child's injury quickly showed him that it was rather something normal to her. As he kneeled down in a place that matched a prison cell, he held out his hand as his head was still bent down towards the ground, as it was written in the novel that he'd come to know the meaning of everything that happened. And in no time, these experiences will become the cause of his sudden lack of affection. Laria then explained further to Duke that peradventure is when someone reaches out their hand to children, like the little boy who sat on the ground and was in severe peril as tears ran down his cheek. If someone like him was given the chance to grow in an environment showered with love, they could overcome that hurdle and mature into an independent individual. As they were still standing by the wall of the gigantic room in the Duke's mansion, The Duke still had one of his hands placed on the wall and the other in his pocket as he stared at Laria, who was still explaining everything to him. She told him that everything she said earlier was from his own educational standpoint, and the main reason why the young lord and lady were in need of her to be their maid. With so much doubt in the Duke's eyes, which could be clearly seen from the way he looked at Laria, he was rather left with no choice at this point but to believe her, because she had rather tried to prove herself more than worthy to be left with the care of the children. So as they were both facing each other, he told Laria to let them all see how far her convictions would take her. The Duke then turned his head away from Laria and was now facing the window side with his nice trimmed hair and princely apparel that had a blue diamond placed at his tie region. He stood and added to what he said to Laria by saying he is only giving her 2 weeks to prove herself, and if she doesn't seem to convince him within the next 2 weeks, they will all continue with his original judgment of him not wanting to employ her. Laria then smiled after the good news because the grace of 2 weeks was rather better than not getting the job entirely. So she stood with his long blonde hair, placed her hand on her chest as she answered His Majesty the Duke, and said that yes, she was confident that she would prove herself more than worthy and even do more by exceeding his expectations. In no time, Laria was now assigned to the room where she was going to stay while undergoing the 2-week test given by the Duke. She was then ushered into the large room by a maid who stood by the door of the room and said to Laria that this was going to be her room from now on. Laria stood in front of the maid and stared at the various pieces of furniture that were in the room, ranging from the green sofas to the large brown cupboard placed by the wall. The room given to her was really spacious. As the maid was done assigning the room to Laria, she bent her head down and placed her hand on her chest, while telling Laria that she was actually going to be her personal maid going forward. The pretty smiled with her beautiful black hair as she gave Laria so much reverence as if she were the Duke's wife, and the maid added by saying she would do her best to take good care of Laria. The maid didn't quite stop at that, as she went ahead and said to Laria that she could clearly see that she must have been tired from today because, considering the time she came for the interview, she hasn't really rested ever since. So the maid then offered to bring some light refreshments for Laria before she got some rest, but Laria didn't quite say anything for a while as she stared at the maid in complete shock. Laria smiled with her mouth widely open after being silent for a while as she stood with her long blonde hair and said to the maid that she shouldn't really bother herself because it was rather still daytime, so there was enough time left. And so after saying all that, she said to the maid that instead of all that, she could ask for a favor. As they were both in Laria's newly assigned room, she went ahead to ask the maid for the favor she had asked earlier, and said to her that now that she has officially become a maid and has been assigned a room, she therefore needed to accomplish the most important task of all, which was getting close with the children. So can she help out? She then practiced how she would actually approach the 2 children that were left under her care. Laria then imagined in her head that she would, first of all, prostrate a bit with her hand on her chest and introduce herself by saying her name. And as she faces the 2 children, she will tell them that she will be taking care of both of them as their new maid. As she imagined, she clearly knew the little children would be on guard as expected, and they wouldn't just accept her as friendly at first. Because they had doubts about whether to trust or not, she was rather prepared on what to do next. If they hesitated a bit, she may just offer them a lot of snacks to be prepared for them. She then smiled while telling all this to the maid, who was looking at her in a bit of confusion as she thought that the plan of giving the little lot of snacks wasn't really a great idea. So the maid was not facing Laria. She told her that Molly actually limited the children to only 1 snack per week. But Laria begged her that it was just for one time, and of course she was aware that eating snacks frequently wasn't healthy at all, because doing so can promote picky eating habits. However, while pointing out all the facts about not putting the children's health and habits at risk, it's still very important to be able to enjoy tasty food with others. Laria envisioned herself with the children as they all sat at the table outside the house and enjoyed the various dishes placed on the table as they smiled and had fun, and she didn't think there was another more effective way to make a great first impression other than what she suggested earlier on. And as they all sat at the table and ate, she would tell the kids that, thanks to a little favor, she had all this prepared just for them. As seen from the different plates of snacks placed on the table, she would tell them they could gladly eat to their satisfaction because everything on the table was meant for them. Laria sat with the 2 children as they took some tea and ate cookies. So as he held the teapot in her hand and smiled at Mikhail as he immediately asked her a question, he asked if they were actually allowed to have all this. Laria then replied to him by saying, "Didn't something upsetting just happen to both of them?" It was just her way of getting them off their minds about what happened earlier on, so they should enjoy and spend the rest of their day eating delicious food together. As Laria poured out the tea from the teapot, she smiled and said to the two children that sat close to her that when they were with her, they should feel free and not be shy. They could equally hold their teacups in whatever way seemed comfortable to them. Although the children were still looking a bit unsure about trusting Laria, she still went ahead to give them more assurance about being themselves around her. Mikhail then went ahead to take one cookie for himself and started eating immediately. He still doubted in his heart because their previous tutor never allowed them to have this amount of delicious snacks. So he then stared at Laria with his green eyes as he held the cookie with his hand close to his mouth. And as the little boy had a taste of the nice-looking cookie, he was filled with joy because it tasted even better than Laria had bragged about earlier on. So he said to her while still holding the cookie, which he had a bit of, and told her that it actually tasted really delicious. Laria then smiled and said that the chocolate chip cookies are also one of her favorites. Mikhail really enjoyed the chocolate cookies as he had already taken another one in his hand as he had a mouthful of cookies. So his sister stood at first and was kind of shy about taking some of the cookies when Laria suddenly told her that she should help herself with some cookies as she had brought more than enough for everyone. And judging from the smiles and bright mood the children suddenly had, Laria was very happy that she was actually able to impress them on her first encounter with the kids. So Mikhail's sister finished tasting her own share of cookies. She said it was quite tasty and continued eating. Seeing that made Laria even happier as she held her two hands together and thanked her stars that she had achieved what she feared at first. The maid assigned to Laria was also in the room with the little children. Laria suddenly announced to everyone that instead of just sitting here, they should rather eat some of the snacks placed on the table. So as the maid heard that, she lifted up her finger and pointed towards herself and smiled as she asked whether she was included in the persons who were listed to eat from the table. As they were all seated in the room with various dishes placed on the table, the two children were a bit surprised as they both stared at each other in amazement after they saw how they hurriedly ate one of the snacks from the table and begged Laria to try it out because it tasted really nice. But Laria sat and enjoyed what she saw and didn't really eat much. Following that, her actual joy was to see the children happy, and since they were already there, she relaxed and observed. And immediately after that fun time that they all had, Laria promised herself that she was going to work hard in order to capture the children's hearts and make them love her even more. Laria then decided that every morning she was going to rush to the children's room, wake them up, and prepare breakfast for both of them. So she sat on the children's and held Mikhail by the cheek as he stared into her eyes. Indeed, the children had already started loving her even more than she had expected. Since her bond with the children continued to grow as the days passed, she decided that she would accompany them everywhere they were going. Even during their classes, which they had with Molly, she accompanied and stood behind as she observed everything. Although Molly wasn't really happy that Laria had now captured the hearts of children, Laria was still there, so nothing bad would ever befall the little children. Laria sat at the back as she attended the class with the little children who sat in front and received lessons from Miss Molly. And to Laria's greatest surprise, she came to find out that Miss Molly is actually teaching 5-year-old kids pretty advanced subjects. Molly stood with a book in one of her hands and chalk in the other as she taught the children who sat in front and were playing. She sat with her long blonde hair and placed both hands under her chin as she wondered about everything that happened that equally brought her here. Laria then said to herself that fortunately, since the incident, the Duke has forbidden all forms of physical discipline and everything has rather become uncomfortably peaceful, but it isn't a bad thing as long as physical punishment has come to an end. Laria pictured herself wearing a red face cap that had a Maid encryption written boldly on it because she was rather confident, judging from how things were going, that in no time she could become their permanent caretaker and also become very close to the Duke's family. And she wouldn't hesitate to use that great opportunity and her position as the children's maid to help build the relationship between the Duke and the kids, because he was rather lacking in that and hardly makes them for time as he visits them in their rooms once in a while to check up on them. But not only would she strengthen the relationship between Nocturne, the Duke, and the kids, Laria said that she will also coach Mikhail, who was the male lead, in a way that prevents his exhausting love ending with his sister, who was the female lead. She then pictured the devastating moment Mikhail placed his hand on his sister's and stared at her lustfully. It was rather an abomination, and Laria intended to avert that. Laria held a pair of glasses in her hand. With her eyes closed and her long blonde hair packed backwards, she suddenly imagined the moment when the Duke actually understood and cherished the happiness that comes from family. She then pictured them all playing on the hill with the children while the sun went down. It was rather something very beautiful to behold. Laria stood close to the Duke and leaned on his chest as he tried to look away from her while holding one of his hands up. As the rays of light shone on both of them as they stood by the window side, Laria said within herself that she would try her best to make the Duke understand and create a happy ending. Something that Laria would have thought was that it would take longer before the grace of 2 weeks given by the Duke for her to prove herself elapse. It has actually been 1 week since she became Maid, and I felt like forever because she was able to get even closer to the children than she had expected. So she held Mikhail in her arms as he joyfully clung to her. Laria's bond with the children grew to the point that they couldn't possibly do most things without her. So as she was in the children's room with Mikhail still clinging to her arms, she didn't go to bed, as his sister had already laid down on the bed. Laria then said to the young lord that he needed to get proper rest so that he could grow up tall like the Grand Duke. And he turned towards him and said, "Can't he see that she is already in bed?" As he gently dropped the little child on the bed so that he could get some rest, Mikhail didn't feel as if he wanted Laria to go and leave all alone as he stretched forth his hands towards her with his mouth open, trying to cling back to her. But Laria stood by the bedside and told the young lord that he should not worry. She would read him a bedtime story and he'd fall asleep before he even knew it. But the young lord still didn't want to go because the bond between him and the maid grew rather stronger, to the point where he couldn't do without her. So Mikhail finally decided to go to bed. He held the bedsheet with his hand and stared at Laria pitifully, saying to her that she would definitely leave once he fell asleep. Why can't she just stay here throughout the night? Laria stood with her long blonde hair and stared at the young lord with so much admiration and care, because at this point she loved the children as if they were actually her own. But Laria was a bit surprised as she opened her mouth immediately when she heard what Mikhail said about their tutor, Molly. He said that Miss Molly comes to their room when Laria leaves, and he doesn't like it. As they were all on the bed in the children's room, Laria couldn't believe her eyes after she saw Janet forcefully press her brother with her 2 hands on his head as they were both laid on the bed. She actually did that in order to prevent him from saying that Miss Molly normally comes to their room late in the night, but Laria stood beside the children's bed and stared in total confusion. Mikhail's sister still had her hand forcefully wrapped around her brother's mouth, and things became a bit tense because she really hurt him by doing that. So he closed his as he tried to get away from her grip, and while doing that, he tried to tell Laria the main reason Janet didn't want to allow him to say what he wanted to share. As the young lad couldn't take it any longer, Mikhail then removed his sister's hand that was tied around his mouth, and while kneeling on the bed with his sister, who stood behind him, he then faced Laria and told her that every night Miss Molly would come and serve him bad tea. Laria was a bit in shock as she stood by the bed with her long blonde hair and hands placed on her chest. Laria stood with her long blonde hair and stared at the 2 children who were seated on the bed, as she was totally confused and didn't know how to react to what Mikhail said. So with her big blue eyes widely open, she had to ask him what he really meant by bad tea. Mikhail then turned to his sister as he answered Laria and said to her that whenever Miss Molly brings the bad tea, he never wants to take it, but she rather forces him. Janet, his sister, then added, by saying that the tea tasted really weird and Mikhail couldn't sleep after taking the bad tea. And that made Laria even more confused as she continued staring at the 2 children and asked Janet what she meant by saying that her brother couldn't sleep. And doesn't she know what type of tea it was? As Janet sat on the bed with her long purple-like hair and big purple eyes, she was a little bit unsure of how to answer Laria because she tried to stop her brother from saying all this. But as she held both hands and didn't want to act weird since she was left with no choice, she said that the tea smells like lemon and mint. She continued by saying to Laria that there was a certain time Miss Molly came in the night to serve both of them the bad tea. She rather hesitated and told her that she didn't like mint at all as she moved her face away from the cup of tea pointed at her in total irritation, and Miss Molly was left with no choice but to serve only Mikhail, who held the teacup in his hand as he drank it, although he didn't want to. After saying all that, Janet said there was another night when Miss Molly came to their room with a large tray on her hand. She smiled and said to them that she had brought a wonderful tea for them. And she said that this particular tea is nutritious because it helps them grow tall. While the two children stood and faced her, she told them that they should please keep this a secret and not tell anyone. So she placed the 2 cups of tea on a table in the children's room, but the tea clearly didn't look as normal as the usual one they normally have, as it had a bluish color. Miss Molly was rather determined as she tried her best to convince the young lord to take it, as she said to Mikhail that everyone would be so happy to see how grown he would turn out to be after drinking this nourishing tea. As Laria stood with her long blonde hair and listened to all that the children had to say to her, it wasn't really adding up, because if the tea was actually meant to make them grow tall and healthy, why did she instruct them to keep it a secret from everyone else? The 2 children were still seated on the bed as Laria thought of what to do after hearing all that Miss Molly did by serving a rather strange tea to them, and immediately she left the room. Janet quietly whispered to her brother and said to him that their tutor was actually going to scold them for telling Laria about their secret, and Mikhail, after hearing that from his sister, nodded his head, his hands touching each other as he feared that they were potentially in trouble. In no time, Laria had gone to the mansion's physician to make more inquiries about the supposedly bad tea that smelled like lemon and mint. So as he sat in his office with his glasses on while keeping his eyes closed, he then placed his hand on his lips as he thought about what Laria just asked him about a tea that smells like lemon and mint. After some deliberations, he said that the first thing that came to mind was workers' afternoon. As they were both seated facing each other in the physician's office, which had a table in between them where several books were placed, it also had a cupboard shelf that was behind where the physician was seated. So immediately Laria heard him say, "Workers' afternoon." She was a bit confused, and that prompted her to ask what it meant. With his hand placed on the table, he said to her that, as the name implies, it was a tea used to help restore energy after being exhausted throughout the day. Laria stood with her long blonde hair and became more inquisitive as she stared at him with her big blue eyes as she asked if the tea was kind of similar to coffee. And her response made the physician laugh out loud as he stood with his glasses while pointing out his finger toward Laria and said to her that the lemon and mint scent helps in refreshing the body, and the content of the tea actually has energizing ingredients, so it's a really strong brew. Lyra was still seated as she placed her hand on her chin, as she was a bit lost in her thoughts and pondered all that the physician said to her. Considering the fact that Mikhail always had trouble sleeping, any time Miss Molly serves him this particular tea, it clearly points out that it was a bad tea, and the physician's description matched hers. So she sat there with her long blonde hair and thought about all this while still in the physician's office. So, as they were still seated, the physician was left with no choice but to ask Laria what actually prompted her to ask him about this particular tea. She was a bit unsure for a moment as she placed her hands on the table and said to him that someone had mentioned it to her earlier and said it tasted really good. But immediately after saying that, she asked the physician if the tea given to children would improve their growth. Laria actually said it that way not to make it sound more suspicious than it ought to be, so the physician doesn't think otherwise. But his reaction didn't feel that way as he stared at Laria with his pair of glasses on and asked her, if given to children, to be really sure that was what he heard. Without waiting for her to give him an answer, because it all felt a bit odd, he furiously stood up from his chair with his glasses on as he placed his hands on the table that had a lot of books on it and said to her, "I hope she hasn't given any children this particular tea, and she should never, under any circumstances, let any child drink it." After hearing that, Laria adjusted her seating position, lifted her hands, and said to him, "No, it wasn't like that. She couldn't possibly do something like that." As they were both at the table, the physician quickly brought out a book and widely opened its context on the table as he placed his hand on it, while showing Laria the adverse effect of this particular tea. He said that Workers' Afternoon contains very strong, energizing ingredients that clearly weren't meant for children. So they both stood as they stared at the words written in the book from above. The physician actually did this to back up what he said to Laria earlier on, to prove to her that it was detailed and documented. So as the physician read and explained to Laria, he told her that the tea is capable of increasing heart pressure, so prior to that, it's not even recommended that adults drink it often. As they both stared at the context of the book brought by the physician concerning the adverse health effects of taking this particular tea, it was illustrated using a diagram of a heart to clearly show the damage. And as Laria and the physician stood and went through the book, the physician added by saying that if a weak child happens to drink even a small portion, it will definitely put a lot of strain on the child's heart. After all that has been said, Laria left the physician's office and headed over to the storage room in the mansion in search of the so-called tea ingredients. According to her, Miss Molly might have hidden them somewhere there because the room contained a lot of kitchen appliances and foodstuff in general. Laria then stared inside the room while holding the door to the storage room and said to herself, "Why would Miss Molly give such a dangerous drink to the children?" Laria then bent down in her white and black gown as she went through the contents of the various cupboards that were lined up in the storage room, and as she was going through the stuff inside the cupboard, it suddenly occurred to her that Miss Molly might have plotted all this in order to punish the children for maybe disobeying her, since a few months ago she was flagged and prohibited from using physical force to correct the children. Indeed, she coined a new method. As she continued her search, Laria stood with her long blonde hair and stared at the various bottles arranged and placed on a particular table in the storage room. While standing, she said to herself that Miss Molly was truly cruel, and she needed to confront her for actually risking the precious lives of the young royals in the Duke's mansion. Laria moved to the section where the plates were arranged and stared at it while she said to herself that even before confronting Miss Molly, she needed concrete evidence showing her hand in the evil deed, because if she faced her empty-handed, it would definitely be a pointless confrontation and her aim wouldn't be achieved. So she stared clearly with her big blue eyes, searching for the supposedly hidden item. As Laria was so busy being engrossed in the search for evidence to use against Miss Molly, she didn't realize the moment someone walked into the storage room that she was in. It was actually the Grand Duke of the mansion. He then stood by the door and asked Laria what she was actually doing in the room. Laria was a bit shocked as she stood with her big blue eyes widely open and didn't utter a word for a few seconds. But Laria didn't quite say anything after the Duke asked her what she was doing in the storage room, so he walked directly to where she was standing to hear clearly from her. The only word Laria said was, "Your Grace," and he didn't say anything after that. As he moved closer to her, he said that the main reason he walked into the storage room, kitchen, was because of the noise he overheard while clearly knowing no one was supposed to be here at this time. Since Laria was still unsure of how to respond to the Duke, or even what reasons to give to him for being inside the kitchen at this time, she stood with her long blonde hair, and she was a bit scared, which could be clearly seen from the way her eyes were looking. She then asked herself, would the Duke even believe her if she brought the case of the bad tea to him, judging that she didn't have any evidence to show at this moment? The Duke then walked towards where Lara was standing, since she didn't seem to be ready to answer him, and he was rather out of patience. So he kind of frowned on his face and asked her if she really didn't want to answer, considering he was caught in a room she wasn't supposed to be in. But to his greatest surprise, Laria suddenly dragged him away by holding his hand and saying, "Now is not the time." The Grand Duke was puzzled as he followed Laria from the back, as she still held his hand while trying to run forward so they could both hide in the kitchen, and that pissed him even more because he actually didn't know why she did all this. She then said to herself that she kind of lost track of time because of the interruption caused by the presence of the Duke, and that slight mistake will possibly give Miss Molly the chance to get the tea and serve it to the children. And as if Laria knew what was going to happen next, because almost immediately she thought about that, Miss Molly walked into the storage room with a candlelight in her right hand as she held the door with her other hand and stared inside the room. Miss Molly walked straight into the storage room with the candlelight in her hand as she used it to enable her to see through the room, considering everywhere was getting dark. As she stared at the kitchen utensils and items that were all lined up in the room, she was a bit surprised that the room was empty because she thought she heard noises coming from earlier on. But the Grand Duke was rather puzzled as he stood closely to Laria as she kept being hidden in the storage room. All the furiousness that he had against Laria for dragging him earlier left as he now kind of understood what was currently happening as they both observed what Miss Molly was doing in the room. As they were both hidden, the Grand Duke was a bit surprised, as he was still thrilled with what Miss Molly was trying to do at this particular time of the night, and he wanted to utter a word as Laria quickly and quietly placed her hand on his lips to stop him from making any unnecessary noise that was alerting Miss Molly. Laria then stood with her long blonde hair turned to the Grand Duke, stared at him with her big blue eyes, and said to him that he shouldn't be angry with her at this moment because she knows he might be, considering her unexplainable behavior, and she added by saying she would explain everything to him later. Miss Molly then stood in the storage room with a jar bottle in her hand as she stared at the contents of the bottle. It was actually the bad tea that was inside the bottle that she held. Indeed, all that Mikhail said to Laria was actually true, and this was proof. As Miss Molly stood, she was a bit pissed, as she quickly recalled and pictured the time when Laria's coming to the mansion actually shattered her plans, and she wouldn't have had to go to the length of introducing this method. Laria had always monitored and interfered with her plans whenever she was with the children, and she couldn't control the kids freely because of her. As she stood with the cover jar in one hand and the jar in the other as she was close to the stove, which had a kettle on it, as she was preparing to start making the tea, Miss Molly suddenly said to herself that she should have punished Mikhail to the point that he wouldn't have been able to let out a single cry. Indeed, Miss Molly was heartless to the point that she would have so much hate towards the young lord who actually didn't do anything wrong. Miss Molly was still standing next to the kettle that was on fire as she stared at it with so much hatred and said to herself that she actually didn't plan on staying here for long because the sooner it was, the better. As she continued pondering all these things to herself, she said that the only reason she was still around was because her ultimate goal was to destroy the Grand Duke, Nocturne. She then went ahead to open the lid of the kettle, poured out a strange substance into the kettle that was on fire, and said to herself that she would do anything in power to come to the realization of her goal. She added by saying she would do anything it takes to ruin the relationship between Nocturne and the children. Nocturne and Laria were still hidden in a separate room in the storage room as they both peeped through and overheard everything that Miss Molly said, and they were even more surprised as they heard her saying that she would not wait any longer as she had no choice but to sacrifice their children now by adding the ingredients of the bad tea. They couldn't take it anymore as they stepped out of the room. They had been hiding all this while, and Laria stood in front as she held the door with her right hand and shouted towards Miss Molly, ordering her to stop and not move an inch from where she was standing. Miss Molly, on the other hand, was in complete shock that someone was actually in the room with her all this time. Because of how pissed Nocturne was, he stepped slightly in front of Laria as she leaned close to him with her long blonde hair. He then looked at Miss Molly and asked her, why was she in this room by this time? And it seems there is something about which he was unaware considering her, so she better start talking. Miss Molly, on the other hand, was in total confusion because she never expected what just happened, and to be the Grand Duke, she was rather disorganized. So as she turned to answer him, she stuttered, and almost fell as she answered and said, Your Grace, you're rather misunderstanding the current situation. She stood in so much shame when Laria didn't let her explain herself because she was rather pissed. Laria said to her that the children informed her that she has been forcing them to drink tea late at night, and to be even more precise, the tea is called workers' afternoon tea, which was the same thing she was preparing right now. Laria added by saying that Mikhail complained to her that every time he finished taking this particular tea, brought to him by her, Miss Molly, whenever he goes to bed and lays down in his blanket to sleep, he rather has trouble sleeping because of this particular tea. She stood with her long blonde hair as she continued spilling out to Miss Molly all the hurtful deeds she did to these innocent children who did nothing wrong towards her. Laria then stood with big blue eyes and said to Miss Molly that she even went to the length to force Mikhail to drink tea that was harmful to him even when he resisted. After saying all that, she asked her what their children did to deserve all this. Miss Molly, on the other hand, stood with so much fury in her eyes as all that Laria said to her made her really angry, even though the things were true. She then gnashed her teeth with her head slightly bent down and whispered to herself, saying that someone like Laria wouldn't understand anything. Even been wrong, Miss Molly stood her ground and was kind of claiming right. She angrily screamed at Laria and told her that she didn't know how things operate in this mansion, and if only she hadn't come and interfered with the smooth run, her life wouldn't have become a mess. Miss Molly didn't only fault Laria, she also had things to say against Nocturne, the Grand Duke. And as written in the novel by Laria, the Blackwell family suffered a genetic disease that was passed down from generation to generation. This particular disease was called insanity attack. She actually created this setting in the novel so that Nocturne would have a high obsession with the female lead character and couldn't control himself towards her by clinging to her. As coined in the novel, insanity attack is when the person possessed by it, Nocturne, loses all of their senses and becomes dominated by violent instincts only. And as he stood with bloodstains all over his face with his hand placed up, it was a kind of cleansing ritual that, for a person under the insanity attack to regain consciousness, they had to be drunk enough with blood to satisfy them. Laria stood with her long blonde hair and was facing Miss Molly as she thought about the insanity attack that she wrote in the novel she now lives in. And her main reason for creating such was because she thought it would be perfect to include in a romance tragedy, but she wondered within herself, did Miss Molly have any relatives who were victims of the insanity attack? Miss Molly, on the other hand, was a bit furious and angry as she blamed Nocturne for the misery that befell her, and this happened when he had his own insanity attack long ago, and unfortunately her younger sister, who was a maid in his mansion, was there to witness the occurrence. As she stood and voiced out everything that was on her mind, she suddenly pictured the moment when Nocturne almost harmed her sister when he was under the spell of the insanity attack. Even though her sister didn't get directly involved in the incident, the trauma and mental shock made it impossible for her to continue living a normal life. With so much bitterness in Miss Molly's eyes, flashes of the aftermath of how her life suddenly turned out after the incident came to her head. As she pictured when her insane sister laid on the bed after scattering her room with dirt all over, it became a responsibility for her that every day she had to take care of her sister and other family members who were going insane. Miss Molly stood with her long black hair and gnashed her teeth as she said to Nocturne, "Did he know how painful that was?" She had to have that much burden to carry and bear every day of her life, and because of him, her normal life was completely ruined. She went ahead to point her finger towards Nocturne, the Grand Duke, as she continued faulting him by saying he thought that if he rewarded them with compensation money, it would ease the pain and burden and make everything okay, right? But the Nocturne didn't utter a word as he stood and was a bit ashamed because what she acclaimed of truly happened. But Miss Molly didn't quite stop after that, as she went on to call him names like trash, like scum, dirty hypocrite, and so on. Because of how hurtful those words were, even as true as they were, it definitely made Nocturne even more ashamed as he covered his face with his hand while standing next to Laria, who was trying to comfort her, as she was even more confused about how things were unfolding in a short time. As if that were not enough, because immediately Nocturne took away his hand from his face and wanted to speak when Miss Molly shouted, "My life!" repeatedly to him, and that he should give her back as Molly Owen because according to her, the life she is living isn't hers. But Laria was not taking it any longer as she saw that Miss Molly was rather getting out of hand with all that she said, so she ordered to stop at once. And as she stood close to Nocturne with her long blonde hair, she added by saying to Miss Molly that she was only trying to pour out her frustration towards someone else. But Nocturne didn't see it that way as he stared at Laria strangely and couldn't blame her because she clearly wasn't around long enough to understand what happened before. Laria was seated in the living room when one of the maids in the Duke's mansion suddenly walked towards her with a letter in her hand and said, "Young lady, you've received a letter." So Laria collected it and was a bit intrigued as to write it to her as she held and opened the letter in her hand. But as the maid was still standing in her blank and white maid attire, Laria quickly pointed out to her that the letter was actually sent by the Sherwood family. And after hearing that, the maid quickly voiced out that the letter was actually meant for her, as Laria added by saying that there was a name written in the letter that says Maria Owen, and then she handed over the letter to the maid. The maid then held the letter in her hand and said that Maria is a friend of hers. She met her before she started working here. Although Maria ended up quitting the maid work due to some reasons best known to her, she would rather send her an occasional letter. Laria, on the other hand, became suddenly intrigued by the relationship that the maid has with Maria, as she asked her if she could read out this particular letter to her. so she stood with her long blonde hair and smiled with her mouth widely open, as she was rather eager to hear out the content of the letter. The maid had no choice but to agree and said of course she would read it out. Laria stood and reminisced about all that happened back then, as she only thought that the maid was only friends with Maria and didn't have a clue at all that the same Maria was Miss Molly's sister. And realizing that made her feel a bit sorry as everything started to make sense as to where Miss Molly's pain and outburst were coming from. As Miss Molly had now moved close to Laria and they were both now facing each other, Laria suddenly had to break the silence and tell her that her maid, who was friends with Maria, told her something. At first, when the trauma started, she had a really painful time, but now she should be stuck in the past, as Maria wrote to the maid, and added by saying that she has gotten better these days, and she has been thinking that maybe it was time she started a new beginning. Maria really expressed herself in the letter she sent to the maid, as she said that even when her sister, Molly, stood by her as she was on the ground and placed her hand on her head and felt miserable, she said to herself that any trauma in someone's life was just like a wave that will definitely pass, and those that overcome the pain will definitely become better people. Laria added by saying that the same would have been said and seen about Miss Molly, but even though Maria is trying her best to stand back up and kickstart her life, unlike her, Molly, who was still swayed by her anger. This particular statement made Miss Molly even more furious, as it could be seen on her face, as she screamed in anger with her mouth widely open and went forward to lift up her hand to slap Laria. As Miss Molly was about to lay her hand on Laria, she quickly used her fast reflexes and held her hand to stop her. And as she stood with her long blonde hair while still holding Molly's hand, she then obliged with her that she shouldn't allow her anger to control her and do something she would later regret doing. As Nocturne stood with his head bent down and his hand placed around his forehead, she felt a bit ashamed because he clearly knew that this outburst was a result of what he had done before. Laria then said to Molly that the Duke always tried his best to help those who were hurt because of him and to help them return to their normal lives. Miss Molly stood and was really pissed as she squeezed her face while gnashing her teeth, when Laria added by saying that while everyone else was finding peace and seeking to forget the past, she, on the other hand, was using her will to use violence as vengeance. As they both stood facing each other and stared at each other, Laria was still holding her hand and said to her, "Did she even know that her sister Maria is learning how to read, write, and even stand back up?" It was rather for her to guide Maria as she was trying to get back on her feet. Laria explained in detail everything that Mary, the maid, told her about what was written in the letters sent to her by Maria. She then pictured how happily Maria sat as she wrote all the letters to Mary. She went on to tell her that Maria wrote and said that thanks to the support of the Nocturne, the Grand Duke, she's been going to school every day and was able to write this letter all by herself. She's happy with the growth so far because she was going to be stuck in this pain forever, but what she was rather hoping for was for her sister to stop worrying about her. Because if she does that, they will all definitely live happily, forget about the past, and now focus on getting their lives back together and making life even stronger than before. But it all seemed that as Molly continued hearing all that, it was driving her even more crazy as she placed her hand on her head close to her ears, screamed with frustration, and told Laria to keep quiet. She then moved away from Laria with so much anger in her eyes, as she lifted up her hands in the air and said to her that she already said what she said concerning what happened that led to the trauma of her sister. So what is Laria really trying to prove by saying all this rubbish? But it all seemed like Molly let her anger get the best of her as she moved towards where a knife was in the kitchen where all this happened and pointed it toward Laria as if she was going to kill her that minute. And she said to both of them, Nocturne and Laria, that her life was perfect and she was supposed to be successful until all this happened. As Nocturne stood and saw what Miss Molly was holding in her hand, she clearly knew the matter had rather escalated and gotten out of hand, so he rushed to where Laria was and shielded her with his body so Molly wouldn't harm her. Laria, on the other hand, stood with her long blonde hair and was in total shock, with her blue eyes widely open, that Molly could actually try to do something like that. Because of the noise that Miss Molly made while trying to stab Laria, the guards in the Duke mansion heard it and rushed in to see what was happening. Upon their arrival, they first went to where Nocturne was standing to see if he was all right. Nocturne then ordered them immediately to grab that woman, Molly, so they ran towards her, and the two guards held her by her arms as she tried to struggle with them. As the two guards in red garments were still holding Miss Molly in her arms, she still didn't stay calm as she stared at him with so much anger in her eyes. With her mouth widely open, she said to Nocturne that he should watch out. His kids are going to inherit the same disgusting attitude that he had. And as they were about to take her out, she added by saying to him that she would curse the children, and their lives were going to be even more miserable than hers. So Nocturne and Laria were in total shock as they watched everything that Molly did, and as Laria wanted to react further, Nocturne stopped and held her with his hand. It was another bright morning in the Duke's residence, which had various beautiful tall trees planted outside it, and it was weeks after the incidents of Miss Molly, who was later kicked out of the mansion because in the end, Miss Molly only treated the kids badly just prior to the fact that she wanted revenge, and she was unforgettable. And as Laria walked through the mansion, she reminisced about all that happened in what seemed like a short period of time. She then stood with her long blonde hair as she held her two hands together and thought about how everything ended. Because of how heavily responsible Nocturne felt about what happened, he settled the situation with just a banishment against Miss Molly. Laria then moved towards the window side of the mansion. The window was very tall and had mirror patterns demarcated in squares, and she stood there with her long blonde hair and big blue eyes. While holding her hands, it quickly occurred to her that it was exactly 2 weeks after the incident happened in the Duke's mansion. She then stood and could only watch as the characters that she created suffered from the thoughtless situation that she was clearly responsible for. But as she stood close to Nocturne, there were some things that might have changed after the incident, but still their lives were not completely back together. As she stood and reminisced about the moment Miss Molly was so furious and filled with so much rage after she was held and was about to be taken out of the room, it made Laria feel really sorry for what she created. And since there were 10 months until the female lead appeared, she wanted to make sure there were no more victims like Maria and Molly to be responsible for Nocturne and the children's peaceful lives. And as Nocturne sat in his personal office in his mansion, he suddenly heard a knock on the door. Before he could ask who was at the door, Laria quickly spoke from outside and said it was Laria Sherwood. Nocturne then stood up and walked towards the window's side as he stared around with his purple eyes, while wearing a shirt that was slightly opened and had a pattern of rope tailored at the center side of the shirt. He quickly said to Laria that she could come in and sit wherever she would like to sit. As she walked into the office, Nocturne placed a letter on a table in the office, and she quickly noticed it. And as she was about to say something, the Duke still had his hand placed on the letter that was on the table. As he said to her, "This is a contract for her official employment here in his mansion." He then went ahead to hand over the letter to Laria, who held it with her two hands as they both sat on different sofas in Nocturne's office. The table in the office also had candle holders with candlesticks on them, with a feather and ink container placed at the other end. And as Laria was going through the content of the letter, Nocturne said to her that 2 weeks have passed since the incident, and the children listened to her very well, so he thought it would be an appropriate time to give her this. And as he sat on his own sofa in the office, he told her both the terms and conditions, as well as the salary should be okay for her as written in the contract. Laria, on the other hand, was a bit surprised, as the salary was 10 times more than before. With his head slightly bent down, he said to her that there was something he needed to say. As he stood and thought about his ugly past that had to do with his insanity attack, he pictured how the force brought him down to his knees and couldn't possibly control himself as he only screamed with his mouth widely opened, and knowing that this means that there's a possibility that she could be in danger whenever he loses it. He turned away from Laria as he felt a bit ashamed, and stood with his purple eyes and black hair. He said to her that he had known this for a long time, but he couldn't do anything about it since he was struggling with his inability to control his insanity and he was scared he could hurt her. He then added by saying that he is telling her this now, even though he should have said something when they made their first temporary contract. After saying all that, Nocturne felt a bit cringe as everything was awkward at the time. So he held his two hands that were crossed together and said to her that he would understand if she didn't want to renew the contract, and his voice trembled a little as he finished saying that. Nocturne still had his head bent down as he felt a bit ashamed after he kind of poured his heart out to Laria. Laria, on the other hand, stood with her long blonde hair as she held the contract letter in her hand, stared at him with her big blue eyes, and said to herself that to him, his insanity was something he couldn't possibly control, and to have confessed that to an outsider like her, she really felt his pain. As he stood in his white shirt and tried his best to avoid eye contact with Laria after saying all that and being vulnerable, Laria continued thinking within herself and said that maybe he was worried that he would get to hurt her in the future because of the insanity attack. It clearly now makes more sense to her that indeed Nocturne was a good person. While waiting for an answer from her, Laria was quick to notice how Nocturne lowered his purple eyes, and his loneliness could be clearly seen in his deep purple iris as his black hair flung around his eye region. That made Laria even more sorry about the whole issue, and she decided that she would break the silence and say something to him. Nocturne suddenly lifted up his head when he saw Laria standing up from the sofa, as they were all in this office. She then said to him that before agreeing to sign the contract, there was something she wanted to say to him as well. She said that the truth was that her parents didn't approve of the idea of her becoming a maid to the Grand Duke. She smiled and continued by saying that the reason she applied in the first place was because she wanted to leave her family, seeing that they treated her horribly, and she couldn't possibly take it any longer. And after saying that, Laria pondered within herself that they were all in a world where unmarried daughters fully belonged to their fathers and didn't really have a say concerning most of the decisions in their lives, to the point that even if they run away and their father demands their return, they will be dragged back like an object to their father's house. Reminiscing that felt a bit odd. Nocturne sat on his own sofa in his office and held the contract letter in his left hand as he glanced through it. There was also a candle holder that had lit candlesticks on it, placed on a table that was in front of both Nocturne and Laria. And Laria said to herself that just like the Grand Duke, she also hid some things about her private life. He then stared at Laria, his fine purple eyes, as it all seemed she was done saying all that she intended to tell him. If he then bashfully said to her that she wished to cancel the contract, he would fully accept it without a grudge against her because he would clearly know where she was coming from. They both sat on their different sofas in Nocturne's office and stared at each other as they both didn't know what to say to each other because it felt rather awkward. Nocturne then held the contract letter in his hand as he faced Laria, waiting to hear her response concerning renewing the contract or not. As Nocturne held back the contract in his hand and saw that Laria had already signed and didn't say anything, he held his feather pen and also went to the designated area for him to sign, and he told her that he was aware of the Empire's law, where unmarried women belonged to their fathers, and after they were married, they then belonged to their husbands. While still seated in his office, he wore a white shirt so that his chest could clearly be seen. He was still holding the letter in his hand as he stared at Laria stylishly with his purple eyes and said to her, however, she shouldn't be scared of anything because she now knows that he is above such laws. Laria was a bit in shock as she sat on the sofa with long blonde hair, and her mouth widely opened as Nocturne gave her back the contract letter. He added by saying that if she could continue to be a great maid for the children, she wouldn't have any reason to worry about such things pertaining to the law. She held the contract letter in her hand as everything concerning her work in the mansions was finalized since both she and Nocturne had written their signatures and names on the letter. And as she was still going through it, Nocturne added by saying that until the contract ends, she won't be going anywhere. Laria then laughed hard after hearing what the Duke had to say about her not having to go anywhere. As she stood with her long blonde hair, she said to him that she couldn't possibly do that. How could she go anywhere without the young lord and lady? In no time, Laria officially became the children's maid and felt unreal to her because, at first, she didn't even think of her as worthy enough to be handed over to the care of the young royals, Mikhail and Janet. As she sat and watched them play as the maid was pouring her coffee, Laria was vigilant. Even from afar, she urged them to be careful so that they didn't trip and fall. But as they were all seated and relaxed outside the mansion, Laria was quick to notice that it all seemed like there were quite a few new workers in the mansion these last couple days. She couldn't help but see different workers moving here and there, either carrying luggage or heading somewhere. The maid that served Laria earlier on stood at her back with one of her hands raised up as she told her that, as you might not know, every year a banquet is held at this mansion, so they hire more servants to aid and prepare for it. Laria stood up immediately and stared at the maid with her big blue eyes. She was in shock as well as total surprise at what she had just informed her of. But it wasn't her fault because she was not around long enough to know the annual events that took place in the Duke's mansion. As Laria stood and was facing the maid with her long blonde hair, she still found it amazing, as her mouth was still open, as she turned to really hear what the maid said concerning having a banquet in the mansion. The maid then nodded in agreement that it was clearly what she said.